Chapter 1. Rockefeller Charles. Waves thundered against the rocky shore as a lone figure labored under a gargantuan dumbbell. Charles, a strapping 17-year-old, standing nearly 2 meters tall, gripped the 100-ton weight and swung it with all his might. Each time the iron bar cut through the air, it unleashed a gust so strong that spray leapt from the sea. 9,998, 9,999, 10,000, he bellowed, sweat pouring down his angular muscles. Shirt clinging to his broad chest, Charles drove on without pause, counting off rep after grueling rep. 11,000, 12,000, 13,000, 14,000. His voice cracked on the roar, every sinew strained to its limit. Finally, on his 15,000th attempt, his arm trembled violently. With an earth-shaking clang, the dumbbell slipped and crashed onto the sand. "Ugh, I'm done for today," he admitted, sinking to one knee as exhaustion washed over him. His forearms twitched, still recalling the weight's relentless pull. He wiped the sweat from his brow and let out a deep chuckle. 3,000 more swings than yesterday. Progress, he said, clenching his fists. Tomorrow, I'll conquer 15,000. Rising to his feet, Charles gazed out at the endless horizon. In this world where strength determined destiny, every rep carried him closer to greatness. And here, on this wind-swept beach, his journey was only just beginning. Charles's mind was racing. This world, he knew it all too well. It was the world of One Piece, the very anime he'd watched as a child in his previous life. And somehow, he had been reborn here. Yet everything felt off. He was only 10 years old, and it wasn't even 1520 yet. It was the year 1480, 40 years before Luffy would set sail. He just glimpsed a newspaper headline about the notorious Rocks pirates, and his heart pounded in his chest. Any One Piece fan would tell you the seas were perilous, overrun by cutthroat pirates, whose numbers would only swell in later years. Charles swallowed hard. Even now, piracy was less rampant than it would become. But give it time, and the Grand Line would be overrun. Worse still, he realized he was already in the second half of the Grand Line. The infamous New World, a place of ever greater danger. Reincarnating as a 10-year-old in this era was bad enough, but landing in the New World filled him with pure panic. Immense waves of dread washed over him as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. After a few long moments, Charles took a deep breath. Panicking wouldn't help him. Not here, not now. He needed a plan. Charles had been a mercenary in his previous life. An absurd reality he never imagined he'd accept. Yet here he was. How did he end up in that line of work? It was almost comical. During a summer break, he'd heard mercenaries in the Middle East made a quick fortune. On a whim, or perhaps a momentary lapse of judgment, he followed a friend's introduction and enlisted. And so his brief, bloody career began. They say if you walk beside the river often enough, sooner or later, your shoes will get wet. Charles learned that lesson the hard way during a skirmish with the notorious Xiaohaisi. Without warning, a melon grenade landed at his feet. There was no time to think, only a deafening blast, the world fracturing around him, and then nothing. When he came to, he was no longer the hardened soldier he'd been. He inhabited the body of a 10-year-old boy in a strange new world. The previous owner of this body had been fishing along a rocky shore when a rogue wave swept him out to sea and smashed him against the stones, leaving him unconscious. Now Charles's memories and will occupied the child's form. The dove has taken the magpie's nest. And so begins Charles's second chance. A mind forged in combat, reborn in a child's body, ready to face whatever this world throws at him. Charles Rockefeller awoke to find himself on a tiny island, just a single town of a little over 1,000 souls, nestled in the early reaches of the New World. Pirate activity was scarce here, largely thanks to the G8 naval outpost stationed nearby. It wasn't the famous G8 base later generations would remember, but even this modest detachment inspired a comforting sense of security in the 10-year-old boy. Once Charles got his bearings, a wave of memories from his past life began to surface. Shards of the One Piece episodes he'd watched as a child. He'd loved the series, but as a mercenary, he'd rarely had time to keep up with every arc. Over the years, he'd forgotten most of the details. Now, to his astonishment, those long dormant recollections came flooding back in startling clarity. His pulse quickened. Even if he managed to retain only fragments of that knowledge, it would be more than enough to steer him toward the story's finale. But Charles had no desire to sit safely on the sidelines. He hungered for risk and yearned to carve out his own legend in this world. Complacency had never suited him, and so with renewed purpose, and with the cunning of someone who already knew many of the twists and turns ahead, Charles Rockefeller began laying out a disciplined training plan. His adventure was about to begin. Charles had always been a devoted fan of One Piece, so he knew better than anyone how perilous this age of great navigation could be. Pirates swarmed the seas like ants, and he wasn't going to die unprepared. Determined to carve out an extraordinary life, 10-year-old Charles set himself to training, and he already had a clear picture of the routes to true strength in the One Piece world. Swordsmanship, rokushiki body techniques, haki, devil fruit powers, and spear mastery. First, he weighed the life of a mercenary and the benefits of mastering spears or firearms. But there was a problem. He didn't own a single gun, and in these waters, firearms were slow-loading flintlocks, hardly ideal. He scrapped the idea. Next, devil fruits crossed his mind. Then he remembered that he hadn't inherited any devil fruit from the previous soul inhabiting his body, and there was no obvious way to acquire one. That path, too, closed. What about Haki, armament, observation, or conquerors? Charles grimaced. Armament Haki demanded raw physical power he simply didn't have, and mastering observation Haki required intuition and years of practice. As for conquerors Haki, legend said only 1 in a million possessed it, and Charles wasn't sure he could even qualify. So here he stood at the crossroads of ambition: sword art, spear art, body art, Haki, or something else entirely. The choice loomed large, but Charles was nothing if not determined to find the right path to greatness. After discarding the 3 specialized magical systems, only swordsmanship and physical training remained. Fortunately, Charles had at least a basic grasp of both, so he decided to give them his full attention. He began by sketching out a demanding workout plan, modeled on the routines he'd seen Sauron follow in the anime. For explosive lower body power, he incorporated weighted squats, jumping lunges, box jumps, and dumbbell step-ups. To build his upper body, he scheduled dumbbell overhead swings, clap push-ups, and dynamic presses. Layered on top of the conditioning drills he'd used while training mercenaries, the regimen felt challenging but entirely doable. Swordsmanship, by contrast, was a blank slate. Charles reminded himself that mastery comes from repetition. If a character like Sauron could forge his skill by swinging his blade over and over, so could he. Clinging to that example bolstered his resolve. He would not let his status as a time traveler be an excuse for failure. Charles spent 2 full days in his modest thatched cottage, letting his injuries heal. He'd expected a much longer recovery, but to his surprise he was back on his feet after just 48 hours. On the morning of the 3rd day, fully rested and alive with anticipation, he was ready to begin his training in earnest. Chapter 7. The Taste of Power. You should know that when they found me washed up on the shore, I was in terrible shape, several ribs and a fractured leg. I could barely move, but after just 3 hearty meals of that strange meat, I was back on my feet. Within 48 hours, every broken bone had knit itself together. The other survivors hardly batted an eye. Here, miraculous recoveries were apparently part of everyday life. Only later did I learn what I'd been devouring. It wasn't ordinary fish or a sea creature of any common variety. It was the flesh of a sea king, one of the mighty leviathans of the deep. In fact, it came from the very sea king that had snapped the red-haired pirate Shanks's arm at the beginning of his legendary voyages. Sea kings are said to possess incredible vitality and raw power, and now, in my own body, I felt every ounce of that strength pulsing through my veins. As I stood on the deck, testing my newly restored limbs, a single thought crystallized in my mind. If consuming Sea King meat could heal me so dramatically, what might it do if I sought it out again and again? The sea stretched endlessly before us, full of hidden dangers and irresistible possibilities. I knew then that a new path to power lay ahead, one I was determined to explore. Chapter 2. The Wild Wolf Gang. They say that by eating Sea King meat, you gain the strength of the mighty. The flesh of the powerful is the most prized of all. Yet for a 10-year-old boy like Charles, hunting a Neptune is sheer folly. he'd be torn apart before he could draw his breath. What he needs most is training, enough power to defend himself, and one day, brave the open sea in pursuit of those fearsome creatures. Charles's island home is tiny. Its only settlement hugs a narrow coastal plain around the port, where just over 1,000 people eke out a living. Behind the town, mountains rise to cover nearly 90% of the land, wild, uninhabited slopes perfect for hardship and practice. An orphan since birth, Charles has never known his parents. He survives on the meager charity of the mayor's household, yet his life remains a constant struggle. If not for his fierce determination, he would never have dared to fish the shoreline, especially after the last time a rogue wave nearly claimed him. Now, machete in hand, Charles steps out of his humble thatched hut and into the vast mountains beyond the port. He doesn't look back. Here, with the wind in his face and the wild underfoot, his real training begins, and with it, the promise of one day standing tall against any sea king. Charles had set himself a simple but ambitious goal, to become master of this mountain. Whenever thirst drove him to his limits, he knelt by a clear spring and drank cold, fresh water. Whenever hunger gnawed at his stomach, he scoured the trees for fruit, on more than one occasion, almost biting into a poisonous berry. Each time danger loomed, though, a warning would flare in his mind, an instinctive jolt, not unlike Spider-Man's spider sense from his memories of another life, but here it felt more like a glimpse of what lay ahead. Guided by that uncanny intuition, Charles learned to live entirely on his own. He fashioned simple snares and deadfalls to catch small game, sharpened stakes at the creek's edge to fend off predators, and every few weeks he would descend to the nearest village, trading the pelts and hides he'd collected for knives, flint, or spare cordage. A full year passed, and far from feeling lonely, Charles thrived on each new challenge. With every sunrise, he could sense himself growing stronger. His limbs, once lean and easily buckled, now carried solid muscle. He no longer staggered like a twig in a storm-driven swell near the river. The greatest proof of his progress came each time he faced the mountain's wild boars. Whereas before he would have fled at their snarls, now he met them head-on, thrusting spear and shield with confidence. Every dawn found Charles alert, his senses honed, his body hard as rock. The boy who had arrived uncertain and frail was gone. In his place stood a young man whose sole ambition was to claim this mountain as his own, and whom nothing on its slopes dared to challenge. Every time he'd taken a serious blow, all it took was one hearty meal, and by morning he was fully healed. Charles couldn't help but marvel at how strange this world of One Piece was. His methods of scientific training on the mountain, hundreds of push-ups, endless sprints, had stopped being a real challenge. He could drop and do push-ups all day and still feel fresh by nightfall. What he needed now was harder drills, tougher tests, and better equipment. So he descended from the peaks with this year's haul of precious animal pelts slung over his shoulders. When he stepped into the bustle of the port market, everyone else instinctively gave him room. He stood barely 5 feet tall, but the stack of furs he carried towered above the heads of most merchants. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Isn't that Charles? I thought he vanished ages ago." Those who knew him well were astonished. For an entire year he'd hidden away in the mountains, emerging only twice to replenish his supplies, each time slipping back into silence so swiftly that not even Mayor Redwood, who prided himself on knowing every face in tow, could say he'd crossed paths with the boy. Now Charles found a clear patch of ground, spread a weather-worn blanket, and arranged his furs atop it. Thick deer hides, soft boar pelts, each one freshly cured, they gleamed in the morning sun. He sat cross-legged, hands folded in his lap, and waited. It took only moments for an onlooker to break the hush. A port merchant edged forward, coins jangling in his fist. "I'll give you a golden bit for that boar pelt," he offered. Charles lifted the hide, gave it a careful shake, and nodded. "Half a gold?" he countered, voice calm. They haggled, gentle barbs about quality, about market prices, until at last the merchant slid a gold piece across the blanket. Charles accepted it with a curt nod, rolled the pelt into a neat bundle, and handed it over. A ripple of excitement chased from one side of the square to the other as more people joined the circle. Mothers nudged their children forward. Sailors set down their crates. Even the mayor's clerk lingered, pencil behind his ear, as if he'd been summoned by some silent bell of curiosity. Charles watched them all, not with arrogance, but with a quiet determination. These coins would buy him sturdier boots, sharper blades, maybe even access to the smith's new training implements. Tomorrow he'd be back on the mountain, stronger and hungrier than before, pushing his body to limits it had never known. For now, though, he had furs to sell and spectators to impress, and in the strange, boundless world he was learning to conquer, that would have to be enough. Charles jabbed a finger at the hesitant crowd, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Are you buying something or not? If you're not going to spend, step aside. Don't block my stall." His shout fell into stunned silence. Market-goers exchanged bewildered looks, their eyes widening as they stared at him. Every uncomprehending glance only made Charles more impatient. Seriously, did none of you ever ask whose spot this is before setting up shop? Earlier, while Charles was unfurling the furs he had for sale, a few onlookers had watched him closely. Then someone murmured, "Is that the boss of the Wild Wolf gang?" At the whispered name, the crowd rippled apart in alarm. "Make way!" someone cried, and a half-dozen burly figures surged forward, shoving merchants aside to clear a path. Out of the opening strode a rough-looking man wearing a thick gold chain and flashing a single gold tooth in his grin. Charles bristled, eyebrows drawing together in surprise. Gangsters in a town of barely 1,000 people? Unexpected, to say the least. Yet he refused to back down. The man stopped a few paces away, boots kicking up dust. Charles squared his shoulders, meeting the boss's gaze without a flicker of fear. Then, in a low, steady voice, he called out, "Boy!" Charles frowned as the burly leader of the Wild Wolf gang approached his stall. "What are you staring at? Didn't know you had to pay to set up shop here," the thug sneered. He flipped up the edge of Charles's blanket, inspecting the neatly folded furs beneath. "Heh, these are interesting. No nicks or tears anywhere." With a dismissive flick, he plucked 2 fox pelts from the pile. "These 2 will cover your fee." Before the gangster could retract his hand, Charles shot out a calm, steady grip on his wrist. "Excuse me?" His voice carried just enough steel to make the man glance down in surprise. The boss glowered, tugged sharply, yet Charles's hold didn't budge. "You'll pay me," the thug growled through clenched teeth. 2 20 Bailey coins." Charles repeated the phrase softly, as if tasting the words. 2 20 Baileys. At that, the gang leader threw back his head and roared with laughter. The henchmen beside him, not wanting to seem outdone, joined in with a hearty chortle, though neither of them fully understood why the boy's calm reply was so amusing. "Ha!" they echoed, the marketplace suddenly ringing with their derision. A booming laugh rang out in the narrow alley. "Ha! Hand over the money. I've never fronted Ash for a job this big before." Bess shrugged free of Charles's grip. I thought he'd just brush the boy off, but he clearly didn't get the hint. "Looks like you're here to make trouble." Charles sprang to his feet and seized Bess's wrist. That smug grin vanished instantly. Bess tried to step back, but Charles held on tight, refusing to let go. With his free hand, Bess reached for the dagger at his hip, but before he could draw it, Charles shoved him. Bess tumbled backward, crashing to the cobblestones before he even knew what hit him. "Boss!" one of Bess's henchmen hollered, yanking a dagger free. The others followed suit, brandishing clubs as they lunged toward Charles. "Let him go, you little punk! You're dead!" Bess writhed beneath Charles's boot, scrambling to break free. But Charles simply pressed down harder, his foot like an iron clamp. Every twist and kick the gang boss threw out was useless. "Look at him," one thug muttered, shaking his head. "He's crossed the Wild Wolf gang. There's no place for him in this town." Just when everyone began to feel sorry for the kid, Charles planted his foot on the bass speaker as 5 thugs lunged at him, a confident half-smile curving his lips. With a swift pivot, he unleashed 3 bone-shattering punches and 2 brutal kicks, sending all 5 sprawling across the pavement. "Ouch, it hurts!" they moaned in unison, writhing on the ground. At Charles's feet, Bess gaped in stunned silence. Around them, onlookers froze, eyes wide at the spectacle. "What just happened?" someone whispered. Charles ignored the crowd's astonishment. He crouched before Bess, his gaze locked on the glittering gold necklace around her throat. In one fluid motion, he yanked it free, then reached for the ring on her finger, wrenching that off too. Before Bess could even catch her breath, Charles delivered a sharp punch to her mouth. Bess's scream pierced the air as she crumpled in pain. Charles stood, casually brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, the stolen jewelry clutched in his palm. The onlookers, still reeling, realized they'd just witnessed something far beyond ordinary street violence. Chapter 3. The first battle gaps and fragments of chipped teeth lay scattered across the dusty ground. Charles ignored the throbbing bass of the street musicians nearby and stooped to pick up a single gold tooth, its edges slick with blood. He needed money, desperately. Ah! Bess clutched his shattered jaw, blood seeping between his fingers as he watched Charles calmly lift the tooth. He and his crew had been prowling the market for days, trying to shake down the stranger who sold furs from the mountainside. Their plan had backfired spectacularly when Charles delivered a perfectly aimed kick to Basie, Bess's strongest enforcer, sending him sprawling across the cobblestones like a rag doll. In a flash, Bess and the rest of his gang went sprawling too. Groaning, Bess's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his brothers in arms. Gritting his teeth, he managed to gasp, "Get out, and don't you ever show your face here again." Charles's calm, commanding voice made everyone in the market take a step back. Even Bess's own men, red-faced and nursing bruises, scrambled to hoist their boss to his feet before running for the nearest alley. Charles could feel the tension drain from his shoulders, and an involuntary laugh escaped him. Ha! Ha! For a moment, the loneliness he'd carried since retreating to the mountains a year ago lifted. He'd spent months trapping and skinning beasts without speaking to a soul, learning to endure solitude, but not enjoying it. This clash, crude as it was, had reminded him that life still had surprises in store. He turned back to his stall, where marten, fox, and even a few prize sable pelts lay draped over wooden racks. With deliberate care, Charles straightened each fur, smoothing away dust and stray hairs. Business was good. Among the elite, fine pelts remained fashionable, and he'd already sold the best furs for a total of 140 million Baileys. The rest of the stock, common fox and badger skins, would barely cover another season of trapping. Still, today he felt a spark of triumph. In his first real fight, he'd held his ground and won. That victory, he knew, was worth far more than any gold tooth. Charles glanced at the fading light and realized he had to move quickly. Gathering up the furs he'd collected, he strode toward the village blacksmith's forge. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, he called out, "Master Garrett, I need to commission some iron tools." From within came the clank of hammer on anvil, then a broad-shouldered man emerged, soot-streaked and holding a hefty hammer. "All right, what do you need?" Charles laid out the rolled-up parchment on the counter. "Take a look. These are the blueprints I drew up, custom parts for a project I'm working on." Garrett unrolled the plans and studied them with a frown. The schematics were nothing like the usual plowshares or swords he forged. Intricate gears, curved braces, odd fittings. "Brother, this is complex work, far beyond a simple hoe or horseshoe. I haven't got all the right stock on hand. At best, it'll take me a month to finish." "A month?" Charles's chest tightened. He tapped a finger on the table. "I can't wait that long. Can you at least make these main components right away?" He pointed to a handful of essential pieces. "I'll take those and have the other parts made elsewhere." Garrett hesitated, only a heartbeat before nodding. "Fine, I'll start on those pieces first. Come back in a week, and I should have them ready." Charles allowed himself a relieved smile. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Gathering up the fur bundles and his half-rolled plans, he headed out into the dusk, already planning which tradesman he would visit next. Charles paid the deposit at the first blacksmith's and crossed the street to the next. In this tiny port town, there were only 3 smithies, so he placed small orders with each, tools, spare parts, and was promised delivery within a week. With that settled, he trudged out of the main thoroughfare and up a narrow path to the old thatched cottage he had rented a year ago but scarcely used since. It stood on the outskirts, its roof bowed under moss, its walls weather-beaten and sagging. Staring at the dilapidated structure, Charles sighed. At least it was better than his old camp on the mountain. He finally pushed open the creaking door, dropped his pack on the bare wooden floor, and collapsed onto the thin mattress. Fatigue washed over him, and before long he was fast asleep. Not far from the docks, in a modest yet surprisingly spacious townhouse, the Wild Wolf Gang held its council. 4 or 5 younger members, noses patched, eyes swollen, lined the walls, shifting uneasily. On the battered sofa sat their boss, Bess. He slammed a fist onto the armrest with a dull thud that shook the room. "We've been humiliated," Bess snarled, teeth flashing. "That brat got past us like we weren't even there." He ran a hand through his hair, then glared at the nearest underling. "I want answers. Who is he? Where did he come from? And by tonight, I want his name on my desk." Silence fell. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The wild wolves would not rest until they had retrieved their honor, and made that mysterious boy pay for daring to slip through their grasp. "I found him. He's an orphan living in a ramshackle thatched cottage on the west side of town. Everyone knows where it is." It wasn't hard to confirm. At that, Bess stood, crossed to the counter, yanked open a drawer, and withdrew a sleek pistol. "Tonight I finish him," she said, voice flat. "You're coming with me." Escorted by 4 of her men, Bess slipped into the night and headed west. In minutes they arrived at the dilapidated cottage. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting pale beams across Charles's sleeping form. He lay on a straw mattress, utterly unaware. A slow, satisfied smile curved Bess's lips. Perfect. They stopped 20 meters from the door. Bess raised her pistol, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! Charles jolted awake as a searing sting skated across his scalp. His heart hammered. Cold sweat broke out across his brow. He bolted upright, every hair on end, and roared into the still night. "Who's there?" Charles burst through the door and skidded to a halt when he saw Bess. Bess stood there, eyes blank, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. Only moments before, he'd raised his blade to strike Charles in the skull. Why had he jerked his head away at the critical instant? Anger exploded inside Charles the instant he recognized his would-be assassin. "You bastard," he snarled. "You show mercy by daylight, then try to kill me under cover of darkness? You're begging to die." With a roar, Charles lunged. His fist slammed into Bess's chest so hard it drove clean through, his arm emerging from the other side like a brutal spear. The onlookers behind Bess staggered back, faces ashen. Bess opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes flickered for a heartbeat, then went still. He toppled sideways, dead before he hit the floor. Breathing hard, Charles wrenched his bloody fist free and let drops of scarlet splatter on the floorboards. He flexed his fingers, then swept a dark glance over the others. The junior guards he'd personally recruited stood frozen, some gaping in horror, a few scrambling to turn tail and flee. Charles gave a contemptuous snort. With a few powerful strides, he closed the gap and instead of unleashing another lethal blow, delivered brutal kicks that sent each of them sprawling in defeat. Silence fell. The only sound was Charles's heavy breathing, the thunder of hearts pounding in the stunned room, and the unmistakable certainty that none would ever dare betray him again. Charles yanked both men to their feet by the ankles. The instant his hand brushed their torsos, their private thoughts thundered through his mind, furtive deals, frantic escapes, and the shame they felt for loved ones they'd betrayed. One of them trembled, whispering, "It's over. I'm finished. Have mercy." "Damn you, let me go and I'll kill you," the other thug snarled, lunging at Charles in a futile, rage-blinded charge. Charles's eyes hardened. He saw the man's hesitation, fear flickering behind the bravado, and in that split second he struck. His elbow smashed into the thug's sternum with a sickening crack. The gangster crumpled to the floor, clutching shattered ribs, a strangled scream dying in his throat. The second man went rigid. "Please, don't kill me," he wailed, sweat beading his brow. Charles stepped closer, voice low and steady. He hadn't meant to read their minds, but now he knew exactly what they were hiding. "You work for the Wild Wolf Gang," he said. "So tell me, where is your boss's treasure stashed?" Even if it turned out to be no more than a handful of baubles or a few dusty bottles of Bailey's, it would mean the world to Charles. The man with the bandage on his head exchanged a terrified glance with his crippled partner, then raised a trembling hand. "All right," he choked out. "I'll talk. All of Bess's funds are stored in the safe at my manor," he said. "You can collect them whenever you need." Charles's heart leapt. He seized the man's hand, his eyes shining. "Really? You mean it?" Chapter 4: Foresight and Mind Reading. Before the last henchman could even form a question, Charles already knew his thoughts, had glimpsed the hesitation, the fear, the split-second decision he was about to make. Without a sound, Charles drew his blade and ended the lives of the 3 trembling thugs who'd failed to answer. The surviving man froze, silver eyes wide, blood spraying across his cheek. "What are you doing?" he stammered, collapsing to his knees. "Please, don't kill me." Charles knelt beside him, voice calm and assured. "Stand up. Take me to your boss." At those words, the henchman's fear wore with relief. As long as he remained useful, he'd live. Bracing himself, he rose and led the way without a second thought. They threaded through dark alleyways until they reached a derelict warehouse, Wolfgang headquarters, the stronghold of Beth. The henchman pushed open the heavy door, and they slipped inside. A handful of gang members lounged on crates, sharpening weapons or idly gambling with dice. One of them jumped to his feet, ready to challenge the newcomer. "Who the hell?" A sharp glance from his companion silenced him. The entire room fell still as every eye turned toward Charles, and the 3 bodies slumped behind him, clothing soaked red. Charles stepped forward, unwavering. The thickness of dread in the air was proof enough that no one here would question his claim to Beth's attention. With controlled confidence, he spoke, "Tell Beth I'm here." And in that moment, the tide of power shifted. Everyone in the warehouse understood. Charles knew their every thought, and he'd already foreseen their next move. Charles glanced at the trembling, blood-stained youth before him and realized at once that their boss must have slipped away again. Everyone knew what he got up to when he vanished. The younger man's eyes darted around the dim hallway, then landed on a reinforced safe set into the wall. "Is this it?" he whispered, voice cracking. Charles stepped forward, running a hand over the cool steel door. "Yes, this is the one." The boy's hands shook so badly the blade in his belt rattled. "Do we have the key?" He stammered. "No," Charles replied, his brow tightening. "Bess keeps it. We don't know where she's hidden it." He pressed his palm against the safe surface, testing its seams. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the boy's ragged breathing. At last, Charles spoke in a low, firm tone. "Then break it open." A spark of hope flickered in the youngster's eyes. Charles slowly circled him, studying the ragtag group of underlings he'd just inherited. If he could bend them to his will, he would never have to scavenge or scrape by again. The boy squared his shoulders. "Yes, sir." Charles paused, sizing him up. "One more thing. What's your name? If you prove useful, I'll hand over control of the Wild Wolf Gang to you. Stick with me. Serve me well. Do we have a deal?" At the promise of power and protection, the young man's fear melted away. Eagerly, he raised his chin. "Yes, thank you, Charles. I won't let you down." Charles sank into the plush sofa and closed his eyes. Ivan, now sworn in as his chief lieutenant, clasped his fists in front of him. "Don't worry, boss. I'm Ivan, and I swear I'll handle everyone for you. From now on, every resource of the Wild Wolf Gang is at your disposal." Charles waved Ivan off with a tired smile. "All right, go do what you need to do, and report back to me when you're done." No sooner had Ivan disappeared through the door than Charles felt the weight of exhaustion press upon him. His eyelids drooped, and the next thing he knew, he drifted off to sleep. When he opened his eyes again, dawn was breaking. A group of maids in crisp uniforms stood by the sofa, waiting with towels and toiletries. They arranged everything at his side and then quietly slipped out, closing the door behind them. Charles lay back against the cushions and sighed. The soft leather, the attentive servants. Everything here tempted him to sink into comfort for ever. He shook his head, steeling himself. "Enough of this pampering," he muttered. "I need to get stronger, no more laziness." Rising to his feet, he strode out into the courtyard. Under the soft glow of morning light, a dozen of his new underlings, in black suits and polished shoes, bowed in unison. "Good morning, boss," they chorused. Charles raised a hand in greeting. He didn't need to micromanage them. He had entrusted Ivan with running the Wild Wolf Gang so he could focus on his own growth. With a nod, he turned away, already plotting his next move on the path to true power. Charles stood at the edge of the dock, staring out at the restless waves. By the time he turned 18, he would set sail and seek his fortune. Whether as a pirate or in the Royal Navy was still undecided. For now, all he could do was train relentlessly and hone his skills. Just then, Ivan hurried over, breathless. "Captain," he reported, "the Wild Wolf gang has arrived, and they've surrendered." Charles gave a curt nod. "Good. Bring them under your command. If any trouble arises, come straight to me." "Yes, Captain," Ivan answered, relief flooding his features. Ivan might be fickle, but no one could resist the weight of Charles's power. With a single punch, Charles could obliterate the toughest foe. And lately, something even more extraordinary had begun to stir within him. Only yesterday, an astonishing new ability had awakened. Whenever he fixed his gaze on someone, he felt as though he could peer into the very fabric of fate. He remembered it clearly. A moment before danger struck, his vision had sharpened, warning him of the threat to come, like a premonition of the future. And in another test, as he met a stranger's eyes, he had heard the person's thoughts whispered in his mind. Mind-reading. Foresight. His new, domineering gaze granted him both prophecy and telepathy. The realization left him exhilarated. He had always suspected his talent might be formidable, but he could never have imagined it would be this powerful. A cool breeze rippled across the harbor, carrying with it the promise of adventure. 19, 20. He would soon venture into the open sea. Whatever path he chose, Navy officer or pirate, Charles knew one thing for certain. With the domineering gaze at his command, nothing could stand in his way. The fusion of two souls had transformed Charles's body and mind. His senses now operated on a near supernatural level, and a vast store of knowledge awakened within him, clear and potent. He flexed his fingers, astonished. This body isn't ordinary, he thought. He remembered last year's mountain training, that's where even the worst injuries vanished after a single hearty meal and a restorative nap. Such resilience was a rare gift. "I can't waste this talent," he resolved. Without proper equipment yet ready, Charles focused on the fundamentals: calisthenics, sprint drills, and makeshift weightlifting. He rigged a crude harness to hoist a 1-ton load, feeling his muscles strain and adapt. A week later, he felt stronger, leaner, and hungrier for more. Early the next morning, he returned to the peak's remote slopes. The true life of a wild cultivator began. He left the Wild Wolf gang in Ivan's capable hands, then plunged into his grueling routine. Sword technique would come later. First, he would forge an unbreakable body. From dawn until dusk, he sprinted the mountain's serpentine trails without pause. Each breath burned, each stride tested his endurance. When fatigue threatened to overwhelm him, he gritted his teeth and pressed on. He recalled an old martial arts anime, where a fighter named Carp shattered 8 mountains to perfect his boxing. That indomitable spirit became Charles's goal. If Carp could conquer peaks, then he would master these slopes, and beyond. Charles's days revolved around one thing: training. At dawn he'd strap heavy chains to his waist and sprint down the dirt roads. By mid-morning he'd fasten stones to his ankles and practice bounding leaps. And before noon, he'd curl an enormous dumbbell in one hand, his biceps bulging with each determined rotation. He worked his core, legs, and arms in turn, never stopping until every muscle trembled. Those few villagers who dared watch were left speechless. How could one so slight hoist a boulder 10 times his size? How could his frame endure such pounding without collapsing? Before long, rumors of a monster in their midst swept through the town. Travelers from neighboring villages whispered the most outlandish tales. "Have you heard? Charles is Hercules reborn. My cousin swears he saw the boy hold up that mountain boulder and then run off with it." "Nonsense. I heard he didn't stop at 1 rock. He threw 20 afterward, just to warm up." "You're both wrong. He's the son of a god, a true demigod, walking among us." With every retelling, the stories grew more extravagant. When merchants rolled into town, they listened with wide eyes and carried the legend of Charles, the Unbreakable, far beyond these hills. Rumors of Charles's exploits had spread far and wide, growing with each retelling until his reputation felt more like a legend than the truth. Unaware that his fame rested on nothing more substantial than someone's tall tale, Charles strode into the great hall and rapped sharply on the table. "Quickly now, bring it out!" At his command, the servants hustled forward with trays heaped with steaming dishes, roasted fowl, glazed ribs, buttery dumplings, and more. Charles wasted no time. He sank into his chair, seized a drumstick, and began tearing into it with gusto. Plate after plate vanished in minutes, every last morsel consumed. When he was done, even the barbecue bones lay picked clean. Not a scrap remained. Chapter 5. The Form of the Sea. Charles demolished plate after plate of barbecue. Though his stomach bulged at first, each mouthful seemed to dissolve the moment he swallowed it. Then, in an instant, a column of searing white energy burst from his body, spiraling upward like steam in a furnace. Ivan, who had been taking notes nearby, froze in mid-sentence, his pen hovering over the page. But Charles paid no attention to him. He cared nothing for the Wild Wolf Gang, an ill-fitting organization that kept him around only to exploit his strength. As the maids scurried back and forth refilling his dishes, Charles felt his hunger subside and pure power surge through his veins. With a sudden rush of speed, he vaulted from his chair, launching himself more than 10 meters through the air. He landed neatly beside a massive oak tree that 6 of the maids had gathered around in awe. Without hesitation, Charles drew back his fist and struck the trunk. Crack! The 2-meter-thick wood split cleanly in half. The severed tree swayed dangerously toward the trembling maids, their faces draining of color. Calmly, Charles stepped forward and delivered a single, effortless kick. The fallen trunk skidded across the ground and flew more than 10 meters before crashing to a halt with a thunderous bang. A plume of dust drifted on the horizon as Charles stood surveying the makeshift arena. He didn't know exactly how powerful he'd become in this pirate world. One Piece never officially assigns levels, but he'd seen frantic fans online classify every fighter into neat tiers. Their system went something like this. 1. Miscellaneous soldier, basic strength, no special techniques. 2. Colonel, can use a handful of advanced moves. 3. Brigadier General, masters 6 sword styles and wields at least 2 forms of Haki. 4. Major General, masters 6 styles, 4 types of Haki, and possesses at least 1 form of dual-colored Conqueror's Haki. 5. Lieutenant General, can coat his entire body in dual-colored Conqueror's Haki. 6. Near General, the rank just below the Shichibukai. 7. Shichibukai, 7 warlords. 8. Imperial God Deputy General. 9. 4 emperors. It was a tidy hierarchy, until you noticed the glaring contradictions. Admiral Garp could casually flatten islands, yet was only a lieutenant general. Gecko Mariah, bloated and slow, still counted as Shichibukai. And Dracule Hawkeye Mihawk sparred regularly with emperors. In other words, the chart was about as reliable as a paper sail in a storm. Charles shook his head with a wry smile. If anyone seriously bought into it, they were only setting themselves up for disappointment. He flexed his fingers, feeling the latent power humming beneath his skin, and prepared to find out exactly where he belonged. 2 years passed. Charles had left the mountains behind and come to the sea. Once he'd learned to swim, he began training with his sword in the waves every single day. He devoured countless novels in which heroes honed their blade work beneath the ocean's surface, and though he'd never received formal lessons, he remembered a few vague pointers from watching Sauron practice, that every cut must truly cleave through its target. Clinging to that one idea, Charles would stand at the shoreline or swim out into deeper water, repeating the same strikes and parries over and over, pursuing that perfect state where nothing could withstand his blade. At the end of each session, he'd pull himself out of the surf onto the rocky coast, every muscle screaming and his mind buzzing with restless energy. No matter how hard he pushed, he always felt unsettled afterward, as though some part of him remained on edge. 4 years had passed since his unexpected journey through time, and he was now 14. In that time, he had trained relentlessly, forging his body to the peak of its age. Lately, however, his physical growth had begun to slow, and the thought frustrated him deeply. If his body would no longer strengthen, he told himself, then he'd deepen his mastery of the sword instead. After a year of relentless training, Charles's strength had finally matched what Sauron displayed when he first set out to sea. Still, he couldn't summon that unmistakable thrill of cleaving through anything without effort. Every time his blade bit into the quarry rock, it left only a shallow mark, hardly the clean, decisive cut he craved. "Boss, here are the swords you ordered." Charles turned as Ivan approached, carrying a stack of fresh towels in one hand and a wicker basket brimming with blades in the other. These were the custom-forged swords Charles had commissioned. He'd become so obsessed with sword drills that he shattered a blade every few days. To keep him supplied, his underlings rerouted every new delivery through Ivan, who also brought along the latest newspapers. Ivan set down the towels and basket, then handed Charles the morning's paper. "Anything interesting in town?" Charles asked, settling on the bench. He smoothed out the pages and froze. The headline announced that the Lock pirates had utterly destroyed an entire kingdom. Below the article, a series of wanted posters caught his eye, each featuring a bounty and a face he recognized from the anime he'd binged in his previous life, Rox D and his infamous crew. Among the infamous ranks of the Rox pirates, the bounties slapped on their captains' heads eclipse anything the world has ever seen, and for good reason. Each man is wanted for crimes so atrocious they trample any respect for life itself. 1 Gilbeck bounty, 13 billion berries. Crimes unspeakably brutal, heedless of life and death. 2 Edward Whitebeard Newgate, 1st Division. Devil fruit, tremor fruit. Bounty, 4 billion berries. Crimes, cataclysmic destruction, countless casualties. 3 Golden Lion Shiji, 2nd Division. Devil fruit, flutter fruit bounty, 9 billion berries. Crimes, widespread devastation, absolute ruthlessness. 4 Charles Lingling, 3rd Division. Devil fruit, soul fruit bounty, 7 billion berries. Crimes, soul-shattering atrocities, no mercy shown. 5 John, 4th Division. Bounty, 6 billion berries. Crimes, merciless slaughter, complete disregard for life. 6 Wang Ji, 5th Division. Bounty, 5 billion berries. Crimes, heinous acts, unrestrained violence. 7 Silver Axe, 6th Division. Bounty, 3 billion berries. Crimes, brutal assaults, total indifference to suffering. Together, these 7 captains form the core of the Rox pirates' terror, each commanding his own division and each carrying a price that marks him as one of the world's most feared criminals. Charles skimmed the morning paper, his eyes widening as he took in the latest bounty announcements. Team 7, Captain Hayton, Muchin, Fruit Logia, 2,000 berries. Vice Captain Hayton Chanwan, Shield Fruit, 1,000 berries. Intern Kaido, 3,000 berries, dead or alive? Actually, capture alive only. Every notorious name on that list was familiar to Charles. He folded the paper and looked up at his first mate, Ivan, who paced anxiously at the edge of the deck. "Boss," Ivan began, voice tight, "the pirate threat has exploded over the last year, all because of the Rox pirates. They've been burning, killing, and looting their way through the New World, right in our backyard." He jabbed a finger toward the horizon. "They've attacked every allied nation and naval outpost along the Grand Line's second half. Their operations center on Beehive Island, and even the Navy's G8 branch can't contain them. At this rate, they'll swallow the entire sea, and then our island will be next." Charles closed his eyes, steeling himself against the rising tide of fear. The Rox pirates' reach was growing, and unless the Navy or someone stood up to them, their corner of the world would be forever changed. He folded his arms and met Ivan's gaze. "Then we have to be that someone," he said quietly. "It's time we struck back." Charles handed the newspaper back to Ivan with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry so much. There's a naval station just down the road, and no self-respecting pirate would dare cause trouble there. Head on down, and if you need anything, come find me." He waved Ivan off, refusing to indulge in his friend's anxious fretting. But before Ivan could take a step, a series of loud bangs echoed through the air. "What was that?" Ivan exclaimed. Charles spun toward the sound. A column of dirty gray smoke was rising above the distant harbor. His heart tightened. Bad news had a way of arriving unannounced. "Come on, let's see what's happened," Charles urged, already sprinting toward the docks. As he ran, Charles activated the mental framework he'd trained for moments like this. In his mind's eye, a 3-dimensional schematic of the waterfront sprang to life. Quays, warehouses, supply cells. He overlaid his knowledge of local defenses, shipping lanes, and naval patrols. Every detail snapped into place around him as clearly as if it were drawn on glass. He glimpsed 3 silhouettes approaching the harbor's entrance. Sleek, black-hulled ships, pirate vessels. "No, pirates," Charles muttered under his breath. He quickened his pace, adrenaline spiking through his veins. He had to get to the station before they struck, before anyone else got hurt. Behind him, Ivan caught up, panting. Pirates? Here? But how? Don't ask questions yet, Charles said, urgency in his voice. Stay close and keep your eyes peeled. We're about to find out what they're after. Together, the two boys raced down the cobbled street toward the rising smoke, ready, or as ready as they could ever be, to face the danger bearing down on their peaceful port town. Chapter 6. A Ruthless Onslaught. Black flags whipped in the wind as 3 pirate ships glided into the harbor, their cannon muzzles roaring fire towards the dock. On the main deck of the largest vessel, a grizzled pirate captain, hat tipped rakishly to one side, grinned at his crew. "Mark my words," he bellowed. "Abundant riches are waiting for us here. Those merchant vessels won't know what hit them." A hooded pirate, knife glinting at his hip, peered through the smoke and added with a savage laugh, "Let's seize this town, pillage every last coin." At the captain's command, the pirates sprang into action. They boarded longboats and rowed fiercely toward shore, faces alight with greed. The townspeople, caught entirely off guard, scrambled in panic. Mothers clutched their children, merchants threw purses full of coins into the water, hoping the tide would carry them away from the invaders. Some townsfolk ran so blindly that they tumbled into the surf, splashing desperately as they fought to stay afloat. "Help! Pirates are ashore! Save us!" one woman shrieked, only to be jostled aside by frantic refugees. "Out of the way!" another cried, shoving past her neighbor in a frantic bid for safety. Cannonballs whistled overhead, smashing into wooden shopfronts with terrifying force. Sparks flew as beams splintered, and soon the first buildings burst into flames. The crackle of burning thatch and the wail of terrified citizens filled the air in a nightmarish chorus. The pirates' war cries echoed across the harbor. "Gold, jewels, and every fair maiden is ours." Chaos reigned on the dock. Screams mingled with the roar of the sea and the thunder of cannon fire. Smoke curled upward, blotting out the sun. In that moment, the once bustling port stood defenseless against the brutal invasion, helpless prey to the pirates' relentless onslaught. "Help me!" The desperate cry cut through the clamoring port, and young Charles froze, wide-eyed, his heart thundering. A strangled groan rose up nearby, drawing the crowd's attention to a burly dockworker staggering backward. A pirate's blade glinted in the sun before it sank into his side. The man crumpled to the weathered planks. "Run!" someone shouted. In an instant, the packed harbor erupted into chaos. Shouts and frantic footsteps collided as terrified merchants, sailors, and families lunged for the exits. Chairs overturned, crates tumbled, and the wooden docks shook under the stampede. Only one man had been felled by steel, but dozens more would never see the morning, trampled in the panic. From the deck of the pirate ship, the first mate raised his voice above the din. "Ha ha! Our turn now, Captain!" Boom! The captain's boot struck the rail so hard it splintered. "Idiots!" he spat, grabbing the man by the collar and flinging him aside with a single contemptuous slap. Then, with slow arrogance, he descended the gangplank and climbed onto a raised platform overlooking the terror below. "I am Alex Jesse," he announced, his voice booming across the quay. He was a mountain of a man, over 3 meters tall, his dark hair braided with silver beads, a savage grin revealing teeth sharpened like blades. "Captain of the Bear Pirates, and wanted for 500,000 in Baileys. Anyone who values their life will hand over every last scrap of treasure now." Silence flooded the docks as his words sank in. Hundreds of souls stared up at him in horror, caught between life-threatening fear and the grim promise of ruthless thieves. Charles clenched his fists, chest tight, helpless, yet determined not to let the pirate captain's roar be the last sound he ever heard. Charles arrived just in time to hear the exclamation, 43 million Baileys! He read the figure in stunned silence. The pirate currency hadn't fallen that far in 40 years. Adjusted for today's value, this haul would be worth hundreds of millions. Charles had no idea how to respond. The entire garrison froze. All at once, Alex Jesse threw back his head and laughed. "Children, seize every last treasure chest in this town, and anyone who resists, kill them on the spot." He waved a hand, and over 100 pirates surged forward, brandishing knives and pistols. "Let's see who dares stand in our way." Charles couldn't stay hidden any longer. With a powerful push from the rooftop he'd been perched on, he dropped down in front of the lead pirate and landed 2 sharp punches in quick succession. The man staggered back, clutching his jaw. "What? Who are you?" he spluttered. Alex Jesse turned, his cruel grin widening as he took in the boy. "Ha! You little brat, you really think you can stop me? Go back to sucking your mother's milk." His crew burst into mocking laughter. Charles's jaw tightened. Without another word, he vanished from sight, then reappeared behind two nearby pirates. Before they could react, he delivered two devastating blows that sent each man crashing to the ground. In that moment of stunned silence, it became clear. This boy was no ordinary townsman. He was a fighter to be reckoned with. Charles barely had time to register the two men's blood-curdling cries before they vomited blood and collapsed to the deck. "Huh?" Alex Jesse's lips curled into a snarl as he stared down at Charles. Fury blazed in his eyes. "Kill him!" He lifted his 2-meter sword, pointing it directly at the teenager. "Move in! Now!" At his command, over 100 pirates surged forward, flintlocks raised, cutlasses gleaming. A sudden volley of shots thundered around Charles, but he barely flinched. With a slight twist of his shoulders, the bullets whizzed past as though he'd parted a curtain of wind. Alex Jesse's scowl deepened. This boy was no ordinary street urchin. Instead of faltering, Charles charged straight into the fray, driving his blade through the closest attackers. Limbs and blood sprayed in every direction. The deck rang with agonized screams. Yet Charles felt only exhilaration. Each swing of his sword banished the weight of his former despair, replacing it with a savage thrill. "Kill!" he roared, voice echoing above the chaos. "Kill them all!" And with that single command, the massacre continued, Charles at its bloody heart, unstoppable. "Kill them!" Charles roared, eyes blazing as his blade dripped with fresh blood. The pirates hesitated, cowed by the intensity of his aura, but their fear did nothing to stop him. Over 100 men lunged forward, swords and cutlasses glinting in the sunlight, yet not one strike found its mark. Like a tiger among sheep, Charles tore through their ranks, each slash precise and merciless. "Damn!" Captain Alex Jesse bellowed from the shoreline, fury twisting his features. He'd spent the last 3 or 4 years assembling this crew, molding them into a force to be reckoned with, and now, on this small island, most of them lay dead or dying at Charles's feet. On the docks, spectators watched in stunned silence. Rumors of Charles's prowess had reached their ears, but nothing could have prepared them for this display of carnage. He moved with inhuman speed, cutting down pirate after pirate as casually as one might slice fruit. And yet, there was no mistaking the man before them. Charles, the very legend they'd only whispered about until now. With a fierce howl, Charles threw his head back, unleashing a surge of energy that radiated outward in a palpable shockwave. The ground trembled beneath his feet as his aura flared, centered on him, and spilling into the world around him. After Charles unleashed that aura, every pirate and civilian on deck dropped to the planks, unconscious. Not a single one stirred. Alex Jesse staggered backward, eyes widening until they nearly popped out of his head. This is a domineering presence, he managed to gasp. How can a kid project an aura like that? As a pirate with 4 years at sea, Alex knew raw power when he saw it, and he'd never felt anything like this. Yet Charles showed no mercy. Unconcerned by the fallen bodies, he swept through them, striking down any who even twitched. Moments later, Ivan stumbled onto the scene, reeling from the ring pressure. He gripped a support beam to steady himself and could only choke out, "What's going on?" He forced his eyes toward the center of the deck and froze. There, unshaken by the carnage, stood his captain, the infamous Mad Slayer pirate, and beside him loomed a 3-meter-tall giant. The giant's face was pale with disbelief as he stared at Charles. With a single fluid motion, Charles swung his blade and cleaved the last pirate's corpse in two. A deathly silence fell. Then Charles lifted his head to the night sky and let out a triumphant roar that echoed across the sea. A low, mirthless laugh rolled across the battlefield. Crimson energy crackled with streaks of lightning as it radiated from Charles, battering everything in its path. Under that overwhelming force, Ivan's legs gave out, and he collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. Nearby, Alex Jesse dropped into a crouch, blade in hand, steeling himself against Charles's fearsome aura. Chapter 7. With the last pirate underling collapsing to the deck, Charles's scarlet eyes cleared. His true spirit surged back, and the heavy cloak of arrogance that had weighed on him simply vanished. Captain Alex Jesse staggered to his feet as if awakening from a nightmare, suddenly free of the oppressive force he'd felt moments before. He stared at Charles with widening, terrified eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Alex demanded, voice shaking. Charles sheathed his sword in one smooth motion, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I am Charles Rockefeller." A wave of relief washed over him the instant he spoke his name. The tension that had coiled within him snapped free, leaving him light and alert. He lifted his blade, fixing the pirate captain with a calm, steady gaze. "And you, Captain Jesse, are my first step toward the sea." Alex's face contorted in rage. "You insolent brat! Talk all you want. Just know I'll make you pay for every one of my men." With a roar, Alex threw himself forward, brandishing a massive cutlass overhead. Charles didn't flinch. Steel rang against steel as Alex's swing met Charles's raised forearm. With a sharp twist of his wrist, Charles knocked the cutlass aside and sent it clattering across the planks. In the same breath, he unleashed his own sword in a lightning-fast arc, the blade gleaming with inevitable victory. Charles's blade flashed in the air, and in an instant, a deep gash split open across Captain Alex Jesse's chest. "Ah!" Alex staggered backward, crimson soaking through his shirt as he collapsed to the deck. Blood pooled beneath him, but to Charles's astonishment, the pirate captain forced himself to his feet, eyes burning with fury. With a roar, he hurled his massive knife straight at Charles, an unmistakable sign he had no intention of yielding. "You leave me no choice." Alex growled, voice low and menacing. In that moment, his body seemed to pulse and swell, muscles knotting as dark fur sprouted across his arms and torso. A thunderous roar echoed through the ship's hull as his features shifted, jaw widening into a tooth-filled maw. Charles froze, sword still in hand. "A devil fruit user?" he whispered to himself. He'd assumed Alex was nothing more than an unusually fierce animal ability fighter. "Exactly!" The pirate's voice rumbled, now distorted by his bestial transformation. "I'm Alex Jesse of the Bear Pirates. Alex Jesse the Bear." As he spoke, the gash on Alex's chest began knitting itself shut, flesh weaving back together until no trace remained of Charles's strike. Charles's eyes widened. Of course, zone-type devil fruits granted remarkable regeneration. He sheathed his sword with a measured click and flicked the last droplets of blood from the blade. "Impressive healing," Charles admitted, voice steady despite his surprise. "But don't think a devil fruit alone will guarantee your victory." He squared his shoulders, readying himself for the true test that was about to begin. Charles ignored his opponent's taunts and lunged forward. His long sword flashed through the air, aiming straight for the savage bear Alex Jesse's neck. But the creature didn't flinch. With a thunderous roar, it slammed a massive paw against the blade, stopping Charles's strike cold and leaving only a shallow scratch on its hide. Alex Jesse bellowed in triumph. Seizing the moment, the bear charged, its hulking bulk crashing toward Charles. He lifted his sword horizontally to block, yet the impact still sent him skidding backward 3 paces. A harsh crack split the air as the sword shattered in his grip. The bear threw back its head and laughed, a deep, wild sound. "Ha! Brat! Now let's see how you survive without your sword," it growled. "Still haven't mastered that blade, have you?" Charles stared down at the ruined hilt in his hand, then casually tossed it aside. He cracked his neck, rolled his shoulder, and balled his fist, a cool grin on his face. No sword? Fine. He could still fight. Charles squared off against Alex Jesse, the savage bear, his eyes blazing with determination. So it's true, there's no choice but to go hand to hand. He sprang forward, vaulting over 10 meters in a single bound to land before the beast. His fist connected with a thunderous crack against thick fur and bone. Alex Jesse tumbled back, stunned. White-hot air pulsed around Charles's body, a sign he was drawing on every ounce of strength. Before the bear could recover, Charles barreled in for the kill. Alex Jesse staggered to his feet, dazed, then Charles's fist slammed into his jaw. The bear never saw it coming. He spat blood, an awful pink tide that revealed a shredded tongue. The force of the blow sent Alex Jesse spinning upward like a rag doll. Charles didn't pause. He soared after him and dropped a punishing whip kick onto the bear's skull. The impact rang like a falling mountain, driving Alex Jesse down in a crushing arc toward the sea. For devil fruit users, the ocean is a graveyard, and Charles watched without remorse as his foe vanished beneath the waves. Charles's blade flashed in a single, merciless arc, shattering Alex Jesse's altered form and sending him tumbling backward. Without hesitation, Charles dove into the harbor's dark water, resurfaced with the limp body in his arms, and hauled it onto the dock. A long knife lay discarded nearby. Charles seized it, brought it down in a brutal slash, and in an instant, blood spattered across the planks as the body split cleanly in two. He hoisted Alex Jesse's severed head, impaled it on the nearest flagpole, and stepped back. The entire skirmish had lasted scarcely a minute, yet the port was littered with the fallen, pirates struck down by his conqueror's Haki or cut down outright by his blade. He paid them no mind as they writhed or lay still. His attention was already on the 3 pirate ships moored at the quay. He climbed aboard the nearest vessel, expecting to find a prize devil fruit that might fetch 20 million berries, or, if it were an especially rare ability, dozens of billions. He combed through every cabin and hold, but aside from a paltry 1 billion berries stashed in chests, there was nothing of value. Beneath the main deck, he discovered over 70 shackled slaves, souls bound for the auction block. With a curt nod, Charles stepped back onto the dock, the head still spinning gently on the flagpole behind him. The port fell silent once more, awaiting whatever he chose to do next. Charles paused at the doorway, surprised to sense other presences within the cabin. Their auras were so faint, like people who hadn't eaten in days. He stepped inside. The cabin's walls were dull gray, the floor strewn with tattered rags. A dozen men and women huddled against the walls, their faces gaunt and hollow, too frightened even to whisper. "Who are you?" Charles demanded, voice echoing in the cramped space. At once, one of the captives lifted his head to regard the newcomer. Charles, though young, cut an eerie figure, his clothes and hair matted with blood. The sight sent the others scooting deeper into the shadows. Silence stretched. Annoyance prickled at Charles's cheeks. He turned to leave. "Please, my lord, wait!" A trembling female voice called out. He halted and glanced back into the dim cabin. Though the light was nearly gone, he recognized the speaker at a glance, a slight girl sitting near the far wall, her eyes wide with desperation. "My lord," she stammered as she rose, "we're from the kingdom of Cacna. After the bear pirates attacked our village, they captured us and sold us into slavery. Please, help us." Chapter 8. 5 Girls. "A slave?" Charles murmured, stepping into the dimly lit cell block. In the flickering torchlight, he spotted a young girl huddled against the far wall. Her cheeks were streaked with ash, but the contours of her face remained strikingly beautiful. He crouched down, studying the rusted padlock that secured her in place. "No wonder she was taken," he whispered to himself. The girl looked up, startled by his calm intensity. She flushed under his steady gaze. Golden waves of Charles's hair fell around his shoulders, and the tears and scuffs on his tunic revealed the lean, trained muscles beneath, proof of countless battles fought. He gripped the padlock firmly. With a sharp tug and a metallic snap, it broke free. Charles pushed the door open and held out his hand. As the girl scrambled to her feet, the cell's shadows shifted, and 4 more girls slipped into the corridor, one after another, each as frightened and confused as the first. Charles stood and faced them all. "I've taken care of the pirates upstairs," he said quietly. "You're free now." Relief washed over the girls' faces, clearing the fear from their eyes. Without a word, Charles walked the length of the corridor, unlocking door after door. Prisoners, men and women alike, stepped out, blinking in the low light, liberated at last. When the last cell swung open, Charles slipped his hands into his pockets and led the small, grateful procession toward the stairway that would carry them away from this underground prison and into the first rays of dawn. Charles stepped out of the dimly lit cabin and drew in a deep, steadying breath. He felt the echo of the captive's despair still clinging to him, an unwelcome residue only his uncanny sense of mind-reading could detect. It was no surprise, then, that Lord Beloric Redfield had such a soft spot for slaves. Possessing the power to read another's heart must make every pang of suffering feel intensely personal. He slung the battered wooden crate, filled with Bailey supplies, over his shoulder and headed for the gangplank. He was more than ready to put the pirate ship behind him. Just as his boot touched the deck, a soft chorus of voices stopped him. My lord, please wait!" Charles paused and turned. He recognized the trembling urgency in 5 pairs of eyes. Impatient, he frowned. "You're all free now. Why are you calling me back?" The girls exchanged quick glances, then sank to their knees before him. "My lord," one of them said, her voice thick with gratitude, "you saved us. Please, allow us to follow you. We will work like oxen or horses to repay your kindness." Charles pressed a hand to his temple. Their sincerity was unmistakable, and the weight of their grateful stares gave him a pounding headache. He hated slaves, yet he couldn't deny the raw honesty of their plea. Chapter 1. The Last Survivors. Why? Charles's shout cut through the restless sea breeze. At once, the cluster of refugees before him fell silent, their faces stricken with grief. He felt a flash of irritation. Knowing so much misery, he thought, was hardly a gift. A trembling voice finally broke the hush. "My lord, we have nowhere left to call home. Our kingdom couldn't pay the pirates tribute, so they struck us again and again. The island lies in ruins. There's no one left but us. The pirates spared our lives only because they believed us pretty enough to fetch a high price as slaves. Please, take us with you." A young woman at the front fell to her knees, her body convulsing with sobs. Charles's anger melted into compassion. He knelt beside her, gently grasping her elbows. "Stand," he said softly, hauling her upright. He surveyed the weary group. "Tell me your names," he commanded, not harshly but with the authority of someone determined to save them. The kneeling girl lifted her chin. Golden hair fell around her shoulders, and her blue eyes shone with quiet dignity. "My lord, I am Martha Bruce." Behind her, a second woman stepped forward. "Kenneth Janney, my lord." "Louise Alice, at your service," offered a third. Her voice barely above a whisper. A taller figure with dark hair and steady eyes bowed. "Hebrew Nell, my lord." Lastly, a small, fierce-eyed girl approached and dipped a curtsy. "Janice Gillian, my lord." Charles let their names sink in. Martha, Kenneth, Louise, Nell, Gillian. He rose, gathering himself. "I swore I would never abandon the innocent," he said, voice steady. "Come with me. I will protect you." For the first time in days, the refugees dared to hope. Charles paused to look at the 5 girls waiting before him. "Do you understand your orders?" he asked. The girls nodded together, their voices ringing in unison. "Yes, young master." A satisfied smile curved Charles's lips. "Good. From this moment on, you will serve as my maids. My name is Charles Rockefeller. Address me as young master." "Of course, young master," they chorused eagerly. Charles gave a single nod. 5 lovely young maids wouldn't be a burden. They'd been on the brink of slavery, and now he claimed their loyalty instead. "Come along," he said, turning away and striding toward the busy port. The others he'd left behind could fend for themselves. He was under no obligation to care for them. He hadn't gone far when he spotted Ivan sprawled out on the sun-baked planks of the pier and unconscious. A swift kick to the ribs snapped Ivan's eyes open, pain and confusion flashing across his face. "Hey," Charles called sharply, "wake up." Groaning, Ivan clutched his side and sat up, blinking wildly at the sky. He staggered to his feet, dazed. "Boss," he murmured, scrambling to attention. Charles crossed his arms, watching him. The sight of Ivan and the others, knocked out cold by Charles's newly awakened, commanding aura, still surprised him. The power he'd unleashed had been far stronger than he expected. "Let's get moving," Charles said. With his 5 new maids trailing dutifully behind him, he stepped onto the gangplank, ready to chart the next stage of his journey. Charles swept his gaze across the silent shoreline. "Where are the pirates?" Ivan spun around in terror, but all he saw were fallen bodies and the town's name stamped into the battered signpost. Charles lifted a hand and pointed toward a crude flagpole. Following his finger, Ivan's stomach twisted. The pirate who had been slaughtering men just moments ago was now headless, his severed skull impaled at the top of the pole, swinging in the sea breeze. You did this?" Ivan's voice trembled as he pointed at Charles in disbelief. Charles inclined his head once, coolly. The branded massacre had been his doing. He barely glanced at Ivan. 3 years of training, and the boy still quivered at every turn. Pathetic. Enough. He turned away. "These 5 survivors will be yours. They'll serve as my personal maids. Train them well." Before Ivan could even nod, Charles strode toward his waiting carriage and left him standing among the corpses. Dusk was falling by the time he reached his mansion. His armor dented, his blade stained with blood. He expected an eager welcome, perhaps laughter or relief after such a one-sided victory. Instead, he found only stillness. Inside the grand hall, not a single servant stirred. Outside, the lanterns along the deserted street flickered in a windless hush. Charles's brow creased. Every soul in the town lay unconscious, as if struck down by an invisible hand. He sheathed his sword and glanced back toward the sea, a chill running down his spine. The day's bloody triumph felt hollow. This silence, this eerie calm, told him that the real battle was just beginning. Charles's return cast a shadow over the entire town. His aura was so overwhelmingly domineering that every guard and passerby along the way collapsed unconscious in his wake. By the time he reached his estate, the streets were eerily silent. Stepping into the grand foyer, he realized with mild annoyance that no one had bothered to prepare his dinner. "Ivan," he said, his voice cool and unyielding, "go see to my meal. I need to replenish my strength." At his command, Ivan, Charles's loyal retain, heir of 4 years, bowed deeply. Behind him appeared 5 timid maids, each curtsying so gracefully it was almost comical. Ivan may not have been the strongest man, but his knack for organizing and managing household affairs was impeccable, which explained why Charles had kept him close all this time. "Right away, master," Ivan replied, marshalling the maids toward the kitchen. Charles sank onto the plush sofa in the drawing room and closed his eyes. He replayed the recent battle in his mind. The effortless surge of power, the way his every gesture had sent foes crumpling before him. That intoxicating sense of control had sharpened his thoughts and left him with a strange, exhilarating calm. He opened his eyes and frowned. Why did he feel so good about it? The fear in his enemies' eyes, the chaos in their ranks, had he truly relished their downfall? When had he begun to enjoy bloodshed so much? A flicker of disquiet stirred in his chest. Had he become an executioner at heart? And if so, was there any turning back? Chapter 9. The Town's Hero. Ever since Charles single-handedly routed the bear pirates and saved the town, everyone treated him like a living legend. As he strolled down the main street, shopkeepers paused in their work to offer him fresh oranges and call out words of gratitude. "Would you like an orange, sir?" one elderly grocer asked with a warm smile. Charles blushed and waved them off. "No, thank you. I'm fine." He ducked his head, unaccustomed to so much attention. Beside him, his lieutenant Ivan watched the scene with admiration. They rounded a corner into a quieter alley where the rest of the Wild Wolf gang was gathered. "Boss," Ivan reported, "today's protection fee collection has gone off without a hitch. Not a single merchant has refused to pay. Even those big importers, who used to dodge our extortion, lined up at our door." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Really? They came to us willingly?" Lieutenant Gong Yifan shrugged, grinning. "They said it's all because of you. Ever since you saved the town, single-handedly defeating the bear pirates and keeping everyone safe, people figure if your gang is protecting the place, they're in good hands." Ivan nodded earnestly. "Everyone wants your protection, boss. They trust you." Charles allowed himself a small, genuine smile. The pride blooming in his chest surprised him. He'd never expected gratitude like this. Life in the Wild Wolf gang had always been about taking what you wanted, not receiving thanks. Yet standing there, teeth bared in an embarrassed grin, he found he quite liked being the hero. Martha and her 5 attendants trailed behind Charles, their eyes flicking from ship to gangplank as they took in the port's modest bustle. Their old kingdom had been little more than a rocky isle with barely 100 souls eking out a living, and no proper harbor to speak of. Without a safe haven for merchant vessels, trade had never flourished, and the scant population had remained as barren as the landscape. Now, standing at the edge of this new port, the contrast was striking. Dockhands and townsfolk paused in their work to bow and greet Charles. "Mr. Charles," they called out in unison. He offered them a warm nod in return and stepped forward, brushing a hand through his hair as he surveyed 3 vessels moored side by side. The ships were clearly former pirate sloops, their Jolly Rogers torn down and tossed aside, hulls creaking with neglect. Each was barely 50 meters long, patched together in mismatched planks and streaked with salt and rust. Still, they were the largest ships Charles had ever seen at anchor. "Even," Charles asked, falling into step beside his trusted attendant, "is there a shipbuilder in town who could repair or even build a vessel of this size?" Ivan scratched his chin and glanced at the battered ships. "We do have a small shipwrights yard," he replied, "but it's meant for the coastal traders. They can patch leaks and refit small boats, but nothing grand, certainly nothing to carry you across the open sea." Charles gazed out at the waves glittering beyond the breakwater. He was only 16 now, but he'd vowed that by 17 or 18 he'd command a vessel of his own. One that wouldn't leak in a storm or groan under a full cargo hold. One he could sail far beyond any island's horizon. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. Someday soon, he decided, he would return to this port, but by then he would bring a ship worthy of the sea. Charles shook his head, dismissing the thought. The idea of setting sail in a tiny wooden barrel, just like Luffy, was absurd. That wasn't the life he wanted. He needed a proper ship, one that could weather the perils of the new world. Leaning back in his chair, he turned to Ivan. "How much do we have in the account, and how much will a seaworthy vessel cost?" Ivan tapped at his datapad, eyes narrowing in concentration. "It all comes down to size and materials. A hull under 50 meters runs between 6 million and 50 million belly. Anything larger shoots up to a few hundred million. Depend on the specs, and if you insist on premium materials, you can expect the price to double." Charles stroked his chin, absorbing the figures. He only had 3 or 4 years to prepare before making the run on the second half of the Grand Line, and he couldn't afford delays. "And our monthly protection fees, what do those bring in?" Ivan scrolled through the latest ledger. "This month's haul was 300 million belai. After utilities and other overhead, we've got about 200 million left. Most of that disappears on your, generous food budget, boss." Charles forced a wry smile. Better that than cutting corners on supplies, he told himself. With a proper budget and a firm deadline, there was no turning back now. He would build the ship he needed and claim his destiny on the high seas. Charles stared at Ivan in disbelief. 100 million Baileys? Just for food? Ivan gave a wry smile. "Boss, hunters don't haul back lettuce and eggs. They bring us sea kings from the deep or wild beasts from the mountains. It's dangerous work, and no one will do it for free. You have to pay a generous fee in Baileys before they'll even think about venturing out." Charles ran a hand through his hair. 1 million Baileys every month on ingredients alone, plus the cost of his training gear. There'd be nothing left for this month's security payments or the ship he still needed to build. He squared his shoulders. "From now on, I'll handle the provisions myself. No more buying from third parties." Ivan's eyes lit up. "Understood, boss." Charles glanced toward the 3 battered pirate ships moored at the far pier. "And those vessels over there, refit them. I want them converted into Neptune hunting boats. Take whatever time you need on the renovations." "Right away." Ivan bowed deeply, then turned and hurried off to begin the work. Charles left the port as soon as he could. He needed to train. He made his way to a deserted beach and waded into the shallow surf, sword in hand. Facing the unending roll of waves, he swung his blade again and again, determined to shatter the barrier that held him back. For the first 3 months, Charles did nothing but slash at the water. Day after day, he stood knee-deep in the sea, the hiss of each strike echoing against the emptiness of the shore. Before long, stories drifted down the coast about the lone swordsman, carving arcs of light from the ocean itself. He pressed on, undeterred by cold mornings or blistered hands, until a full 1.5 years had passed. Then one dawn, his breakthrough came. With a single fluid motion, his blade ignited a 10-meter arc of swordlight through the morning mist, carving a luminous path along the beach. Staring at that flawless streak, Charles felt tears sting his eyes. After 18 months of relentless practice, he'd finally made a name for himself. He had reached the realm of the swordsman. His strength now rivaled that of an ordinary lieutenant general. He still lacked the formal bearing and commanding presence of a battle-hardened officer, but Charles was certain of one thing. Even if he faced a lieutenant general in battle, he could hold his ground. Charles stood alone on the windswept beach, every fiber of his being humming with power. The legendary sword hero's signature technique, flying slash, blazed along his blade in streaks of brilliant light, while the elusive color of knowledge pulsed around him in a shifting haze of sapphire. This gift, which could read minds and even glimpse the threads of the future, carried with it a heady arrogance. He'd unleashed that arrogance once before and felt it threatened to overwhelm him, so he'd held himself back ever since. But mastery demanded practice, and today, at last, Flying Slash bent perfectly to his will. He gripped the long sword, knuckles whitening, and with a single fluid motion sent it whistling toward the sand. The blade tore a clean arc through the beach, spraying golden grains in its wake. A laugh, loud and unrestrained, burst from his lips. Ha 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 ha! His heart thundered in his chest as he watched the scar he'd carved into the earth. This was triumph, pure and simple. At the edge of the dunes, 5 maids stood in a neat line, their eyes alight with admiration. They had watched him practice from the moment he arrived at dawn, and now, with cheeks flushed and weapons sheathed, he offered them a broad grin. With a gesture, he slid the sword back into its scabbard. "Master," they called in unison, stepping forward to present neatly folded towels. Gillian, the eldest among them, bowed slightly and handed Charles a soft cloth. He took it, dabbing at his forehead and brushing loose strands of hair aside. "All right," he said, his voice calm but bright with satisfaction. "Let's head home." "Yes, master," they echoed, their excitement barely contained. Together, Charles and his 5 devoted attendants turned from the beach and strode back toward the estate, each step carrying him closer to the next challenge, and to the full command of the power that lay within him. "Young master," the 5 maids called in unison as Charles strode back into the villa. Ivan, his steward, hurried forward. "Sir, we're almost out of Neptune fish in the kitchen. Could you hunt some more?" Charles offered a wry smile. "Of course. Over the past 3 months, I've taken down nearly every sea king in these waters. Neptunes, offshore lords, even the larger shoals. Tomorrow I'll push farther out to sea." Indeed, after 90 days of relentless hunting, Charles had all but eradicated the sea kings near the island. The once teeming waters were now nearly empty of sizable fish. Chapter 10. Treasure Chest. The next morning, Charles led a dozen of his younger shipmates out to sea aboard the fishing vessel converted from 3 captured pirate ships. These boys were all skilled sailors, and as soon as they learned that Charles planned to hunt Neptunes on the open ocean, each volunteered to take a post at the helm, or the lookout. Now the patched-up fishing boat slipped silently away from the harbor into uncharted waters. This was as far as Charles had ever sailed before. As the shoreline shrank behind him, he steadied his nerves, ready for whatever lay ahead. "Captain, a ship off the starboard bow," came the urgent cry from the crow's nest. Charles climbed onto the deck's raised platform and paused. He closed his eyes, centering himself, then tapped into his navigator's instincts, an almost prescient sense he'd honed at sea. In his mind's eye, a shadowy silhouette drifted into focus some distance ahead. Charles's curiosity flared. Was it a merchant vessel or another pirate ship? Before he could decide, a sudden boom echoed across the waves. Cannon fire streaked toward them, and iron shots slammed into the hull. There was no doubt now, it was a pirate ship, and they were under attack. Charles's heart pounded. "All hands, battle stations," he roared, as the boys scrambled to man their posts. The fight had begun. Charles's sharp command cut through the rising panic aboard his ship. The opposing gunners' aim was so off that every shot splashed harmlessly around them, but even those near misses had the crew shouting and stumbling for cover. "Steady on deck," Charles called, his voice carrying over the roar of the waves. "I've got it under control." A dozen sailors glanced at one another, hearts pounding, then forced themselves to refocus. Charles strode forward, eyes locked on the next incoming cannonball. "You, take the helm. The rest of you, prepare to board those pirates once I clear the way." Before anyone could argue, Charles sprang up the deck's rail. A moment later, the cannonball flew right at him. Without flinching, he slammed his fist into its iron shell. The impact detonated it in a flash of fire and shrapnel, high above the deck, far from any crewmate. Charles landed in a crouch, completely uninjured. A cheer went up. "That's our captain," one young sailor cried. "He's unstoppable." Far off on the pirate ship, their captain watched through a spyglass, jaw clenched. "By the winds, that's no ordinary boy," he muttered to his first mate. "He just punched a cannonball out of the sky." Back on Charles's deck, the sailor with the spyglass lowered his instrument with renewed confidence. "What are you scared of now?" he shouted at his comrades. "If he can do that, what chance do those pirates have against us?" Charles offered a calm, wry smile. "All right, men, let's finish this." He drew his sword, and the sailors fell in behind him, their fear replaced by fierce determination. On the pirate ship, the captain barked orders. "Port side, ready to fire! Ram them if you have to!" His crew scrambled at his command, but the fire in their eyes had dimmed ever so slightly, now that they knew the boy leading the enemy would not be so easily defeated. Charles grinned as the pirate brigantine loomed closer. At first, he'd feared their cannons would tear him and his companions to shreds, but the raiders held back, confident of an easy victory. "Don't worry," he murmured. "I'll handle this." Drawing on the rudimentary training he'd picked up back at the Naval Academy, what they called the moon step, Charles surged upward. He couldn't sustain true flight or reach great heights, but he could hurl himself across short distances with surprising speed. Bounding through the air just above deck level, he landed nimbly on the pirate ship's planked rail. "Boy, who the hell are you?" barked the pirate captain, eyes widening as he stumbled backward. The crew had expected a token resistance, maybe a few skirmishers at most, not a lone youth crashing their party. Charles spared the captain a cool glance. "Pirates, right?" He gestured toward the skull and crossbones banner snapping overhead. Before the captain could stammer a reply, Charles closed the distance in an instant and delivered a solid right hook. The crack of bone against bone echoed across the deck as the pirate captain crumpled to the floorboards. Silence reigned for a heartbeat, broken only by the captain's pained groan. Charles stood over him, chest heaving, eyes sharp. In that moment, the tide of this little naval showdown had turned, and Charles intended to see it all the way through. "Give it to me." The scarred pirate captain raised a gloved hand to half cover his face and sneered at Charles's crew. He had barely finished the demand before Charles sprang into action. A faint, almost amused smile curved Charles's lips as he surveyed the swarming pirates before him. He didn't draw his sword. Instead, he cracked his knuckles and sprinted into their midst. His fists flew faster than anyone could follow. Thud, thud, thud. One by one, the pirates crumpled under the onslaught, some with chests crushed inward, others whose heads had quite literally been blown apart. Not a single man remained standing. The captain's taunting expression froze into stark terror as he stumbled backward. He barely had time to register Charles's blood-smeared knuckles before Charles leaped forward and landed a single devastating blow to his skull. In an instant, the captain's head split open. His body collapsed, headless, blood and shreds of flesh splattering across the deck. Charles stood over the ruin of his foe, chest rising and falling in calm control, as the last whispers of resistance died on the wind. Charles surveyed the deck, where the fallen fisherman lay in grim silence. He ran a hand through his hair and muttered under his breath, "When did I become such a monster? Not a single soul left alive." He raised an arm and signaled to a small fishing skiff tethered alongside. At his gesture, more than a dozen sailors scrambled into action, rowing with feverish speed until they drew alongside Charles's vessel. They clambered aboard, legs trembling as they caught sight of the corpses littering the deck. "Boss!" they whispered, voices quivering. Charles met their anxious gazes and issued a cool command. "Stack the bodies here. We'll use them to lure out the Sea Kings." Yes, sir," they stammered, hands shaking as they hauled the bodies into a neat pile at his direction. Once the sailors were busy with their grim task, Charles slipped below decks, eager to see what treasures might lie hidden in the captain's cabin. He eased open drawers and overturned papers, but every corner was empty, except for one sturdy wooden chest tucked beneath the table. Its dimensions were oddly familiar, no larger than a devil fruit. His heart pounded as he knelt before it. Could this be the stroke of luck he'd been praying for? With a deep breath, Charles lifted the lid, ready to discover what lay inside. Charles's first day at sea turned out to be far more eventful than he'd ever imagined. While exploring the captain's quarters, he pried open an old trunk with all his strength. The lock snapped, and the lid creaked upward to reveal an odd, swirled fruit perched on a velvet cushion, unmistakably a devil fruit. Beneath the fruit lay a rolled parchment, a hand-drawn chart of strange islands and winding sea routes. Charles ran a finger along the faded ink, A treasure map, he murmured. If this points to a pirate captain's hidden hoard, where could it lead? He carefully folded the chart and tucked it into his satchel, determined to study it more later. While rifling through a stack of wanted posters pinned to the bulkhead, Charles laughed in contempt. Each bounty read a mere 100 berries. A pirate that low profile has little right to swagger around, he scoffed. Then, behind a loose floorboard, he uncovered something far more valuable, nearly 600 million berries in neatly bundled stacks. A grin spread across his face. With this kind of money, anything's possible. His thoughts were interrupted by a panicked shout from the deck. "Boss, help! There are so many sea kings out there!" Charles bolted up the ladder, heart pounding. Sea kings? How many? He burst onto the deck just in time to see dozens, no, hundreds, of colossal serpentine beasts thrashing in the waves around the ship. Their glowing eyes peered up at him from beneath the churning water. Charles's blood ran cold. The treasure map in his pocket suddenly felt more daunting than ever. Did I just poke the nest of the sea kings? Charles burst from the captain's cabin onto the deck, heart pounding. All around the pirate ship, enormous shapes churned the water, Neptunes, the dread sea kings, their guttural cries shaking the timbers. The crew scattered in panic. "Get that corpse overboard," Charles barked, pointing at the fallen sailor. "It'll buy us a few seconds. Helm, full speed ahead. Follow my lead." First Mate Rowan's eyes were wide with fear. "Boss, they're cutting off our bow. We're boxed in." At the wheel, Barrett froze as a massive sea king reared up beside the rail, its jaws snapping shut inches from the deck. Then it bellowed, "Insolent humans!" Without hesitation, Charles drew his long sword. The blade flashed silver under the stormy sky as he braced himself, ready to face the wrath he had unleashed. Chapter 11, Attack of the Sea Kings. Charles braced himself at the bow, staring in disbelief at the colossal sea kings towering off the port side, each easily 30 meters long. How had they drawn in so many Neptune-class monsters at once? "Captain, the sea kings are attacking," he yelled back toward the stern. Shouts of alarm rang out from the crew as the first great tail swung toward the ship. Without a second thought, Charles sprinted to the rail. As the tail came whipping down, he leapt up, drove his fist into its armored fluke, and tore a jagged hole through bone and scale. A fierce bellow tore from the 10-meter-long Neptune. Its roar set off a chain reaction among its brethren. 7 more sea kings surged forward in unison, their heads crashing against the hull and their sinuous bodies thrashing the water into froth. The deck shuddered beneath Charles's feet, timbers groaning. Salt spray stung his face, and the terrified cries of his shipmates spurred him on. He planted his feet, squared his shoulders, and let loose a roar of his own. "We won't go down without a fight." As the enraged leviathans circled closer, Charles tightened his fists. The wind whipped through his hair. The din of battle rose all around, and in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning. Charles stared at the dark expanse beneath the hull, bewildered. Why had these sea kings lurked silently on the ocean floor, only to surface now? He couldn't believe that a few dozen corpses floating in the current would draw out dozens of 100-meter leviathans. But before he could gather his thoughts, 7 or 8 colossal silhouettes burst from the depths, charging straight for the ship. Alarm flaring in his chest, he roared, "Hold on to the railings!" With that, Charles vaulted off the deck and plunged into the roiling sea. Employing his moonstep technique, he skimmed across the waves, closing the distance in seconds. He bore down on the largest creature, a sea king nearly 70 meters in length, and drew his longsword with a single, fluid motion. Channeling all his strength, he swung in a dazzling 10-meter arc. The blade met its mark with a thunderous crack, cleaving through bone and sinew in an instant. Crimson rivers gushed into the surf as the wounded sea king writhed in agony, its gargantuan body thrashing against the swell. Charles braced himself on the churning water, eyes locked on the creature's desperate flails. He would not allow its final convulsions to threaten his ship or crew. Drawing a steady breath, he readied himself to deliver the finishing blow and ensure no more of these monsters rose to challenge him. Charles stood firm on the rocking deck, his eyes scanning the raging sea. A sudden swell rocked the ship, and a panicked cry rang out. A young sailor had tumbled overboard. Without a moment's hesitation, Charles drew his blade and delivered a sweeping backhand slash. A 10-meter arc of steel sliced through the turbulent waters, striking the wounded sea beast, an immense, whale-like Neptune. The creature shuddered once, then went limp, its great form drifting down into the depths. Ignoring the corpse beneath his feet, Charles vaulted toward the rail. "Save him!" he snarled under his breath. Below, the boy struggled in the waves, the sea's pull dragging him under with every crest and trough. Gurgling, he slapped at the water, crying, "Help! Please! Anyone!" Charles launched himself over the railing and plunged into the frothing surf. In a single powerful movement, he seized the boy's jacket collar, hauled him to the surface, and battled the current back to the ship's side. With a Herculean heave, he threw the drenched child onto the deck. The boy coughed and sputtered, but he was alive. "Grab the handrails and don't let go," Charles barked to the crew. "I'll deal with the rest of them." At his command, every pirate on board clutched the iron railings, knuckles white. From the dark waters below, more sea kings, sleek, predatory shapes, circled, drawn by the slaughter of their kin. Charles wiped seawater from his brow, tightened his grip on the hilt of his blade, and faced the looming threat with steely resolve. The tide of battle was far from over. Chapter 7. The Perfect Ship. "This is the boat I've been looking for." Before him lay a vessel so pristine it looked fresh from the shipyard. With a few custom tweaks back at port, it would be perfect, provided it didn't end up wrecked by the Neptunes first. Charles didn't pause to admire the craftsmanship. He vaulted onto the deck, sword drawn. The first Sea King surged forward, tentacles coiling and fangs glinting. Charles met it head-on, plunging his blade into its skull. In an instant, the sword's energy detonated, obliterating the creature's brain. Its body collapsed, lifeless, to the deck. Without hesitation, Charles spun on his heel and charged the next beast. Another fierce strike, another explosion of blade energy, and the second Sea King was down. Two of the pack's fiercest warriors lay dead before the others even realized what had happened. The remaining Neptunes faltered. They broke off their assault on the ship and closed in around Charles instead, forming a tight semicircle. He stood atop the piled corpses, chest heaving, blade at the ready. Silence fell, tense, deadly silence, until the water ahead shivered. From the depths rose a gargantuan squid, its tentacles writhing like serpents. Easily 20 meters across, it eclipsed the deck, blotting out the sun. Charles' heart hammered. He had no intention of wrestling a creature that size. But if his instincts were right, this Leviathan was the boss of the Neptunes that had come to destroy his prize. He tightened his grip on the hilt. Across the sable waves, steel met ink-black water, and Charles braced himself for the fight of his life. After the Squid Titan lashed out, the other Sea Titans stirred in response. But in doing so, they opened a path for Charles to exploit. Though each Leviathan towered over his under 2-meter frame, his size became an unexpected advantage. With uncanny agility, he bounded from one massive skull to another, drawing their claws in crushing blows, and meeting each with his own counterstrikes. At every opening, he unleashed his signature flying slash, the wind-whistling blade severing flesh like silk. In no more time than it takes to sip a cup of tea, 2 more Titans collapsed beneath his assault, their colossal bodies crashing back into the waves. A thunderous chorus of roars erupted, some furious, some terrified. The smaller Sea Titans, wounded and unnerved, plunged beneath the surface, vanishing into the depths. Only 3 remained above water. The Squid Titan and 2 equally formidable companions, now forming a tight siege around Charles. Even the restless waters of Quanban Botao fell eerily silent, as if holding their breath. Far to the rear, the 4 support ships had been scattered by the surging tide. From that distant vantage, Charles's crewmates could do nothing but watch through binoculars, their hearts pounding. Standing amid the circling giants, Charles swallowed hard, every muscle tensed and blade at the ready, prepared for whatever attack might come next. A sudden vision flashed through Charles's mind, Xia Lu racing up the moonlit steps. In that same instant, the giant squid facing him unleashed a massive cloud of ink, coating the water exactly where he'd been standing. Within moments, the sea's surface for several meters around went pitch black. Suspended in midair, Charles felt a cold sweat break out, not from the darkness, but from what he'd just realized. The squid's ink was corrosive. He stole a glance at the Sea King's corpse drifting nearby. Its flesh had already begun to melt away, the remains noticeably shrunken. What kind of Neptune power is this? Corrosive ink. Why didn't they ever show this in the anime? He muttered in disbelief. Then he shook his head, relief washing over him. Good thing I saw it coming, otherwise I'd have been in for a real shock today. But relief quickly turned to anger. Charles fixed his gaze on the massive squid, steeling himself. He thrust out his hand, and a blade of energy over 10 meters long slashed through the air toward the creature. The squid, its bulk preventing any real evasion, could only fling up its tentacles in a haphazard shield, bracing for the blow. Charles's blade flashed in a wave of force, striking the squid's tentacle and slicing it cleanly down the middle. A guttural roar of pain erupted from the beast as it expelled a jet of ink in all directions. The inky cloud filled the air, blinding the two smaller creatures at its side and sending them scurrying for cover. Seizing the moment, Charles sprang into the air, closing the distance with the wounded Leviathan in an instant. He drew back his longsword and brought it down in a single fluid motion, steel biting through flesh and bone. With that final strike, the colossal squid split apart from head to tail, its two halves collapsing in a heap as the echoes of battle faded away. Chapter 12. The Mayor's Invitation. The monstrous Sea King squid collapsed in an instant, its massive body expelling a torrent of inky blackness that turned the surrounding water into a churning void. Charles stumbled only briefly before planting his boots firmly on the creature's slick carcass. Two smaller Neptunes, witnessing the fall of their leader, let out startled cries, flicked their tails, and vanished into the dark depths, swallowed up by Charles's lingering aura of dominance. Perched on the floating remains, Charles surveyed the ink-stained ocean. He had defeated 5 Neptunes in rapid succession. The rest had fled at the first sign of his power. Yet each explosion, each surge of energy, had taken its toll, and exhaustion weighed heavily on him. Beside him, his sister Xiaolu settled herself atop the squid's shell without a word. She didn't ask for his help. She preferred to reclaim her strength on her own. Below them, the sea surface lay thick with corrosive ink. Charles knew better than to signal for the rescue boats. The stained water would have eaten through their hulls in moments. Half an hour passed before the ocean's oily sheen finally dispersed, revealing the shifting blue waves beneath. When the last wisps of ink dissolved, Charles raised his hand in a clear signal. On the 4 guard ships circling the perimeter, every lookout snapped to attention. In an instant, the signal was understood. The vessels glided forward, cutting through the now pristine water, ready to pick up Charles and Xiaolu, and carry them onward to whatever invitation awaited them next. Charles barely had time to catch his breath before one of the 4 small craft broke away and drifted toward him. He leapt aboard without hesitation. "Hurry!" he shouted. "Hook up every Sea King we've felled and pull out of here. Now!" His heart pounded. If those massive Sea Kings regrouped, they'd swamp them in an instant. The mid-sized ones had already been a struggle. There was no way he could hope to drag in the truly colossal specimens. Better to leave them be than risk losing everything. "Aye, Captain!" the dozen crewmen cried in unison. They flung iron hooks out over the gunwales, each line snaring the carcass of a slain Sea King. Once every hook caught fast, the helmsman, with a few practiced tugs, guided their skiff alongside the other 3. Sailors on each boat lashed lines together. Soon all 4 boats were locked in a chain, the wounded beasts of the deep straining behind them. Originally, they'd hunted 5 mighty Sea Kings, but one of the giants had erupted a cloud of squid ink in its dying throes, smearing its flesh so thoroughly that Charles refused to risk contaminating the rest of their catch. He ordered the blackened carcass cut loose and abandoned. With 4 hulking bodies in tow, the flotilla set its course for their island. Behind them, the restless waves stilled as if nothing had happened. The sea returned to its deceptive calm. Their navigator kept a sharp eye on the charts and the stars. There was no fear of missing the way back. Charles, leaning on the rail of his boat, allowed himself a moment's relief. They were safe for now, and rich beyond measure once they turned these Sea King carcasses into oil and bone. He smiled grimly at the horizon. Tomorrow, the world would once again tremble at the name of Charles Drake, Sea King Slayer. Charles sat at the head of the dining table, hungrily replenishing his strength. The bitter taste of salt and blood still lingered in his mind from their recent hunt. Though they'd managed to fell 4 mighty Neptunes, giant sea kings whose bodies stretched dozens of meters, Charles had called the operation off before they could reach their true objective. Those beasts fought ferociously, and pressing on would have meant unacceptable losses. Still, the haul was nothing to scoff at. Each sea king's carcass alone would feed the crew for an entire month. Charles planned to rest here, on this small island, until they'd turned that supply into fresh rations and new weapons. Then he'd lead them back to finish the job. Yet the unexpected prize of the voyage was a sleek, barely used pirate ship drifting off course, and over 1,000 wanted men and women captured aboard. Delivering them to the Navy's G8 district would net them a fortune in bounties, enough to outfit their fleet for months to come. As the flagship dropped anchor, a dark speck on the horizon resolved itself into the familiar slopes of their home island. First-time sailors crowded the rail, tears in their eyes. They had stared death in the face on the open sea. Without their captain's steady hand, they wouldn't have come home. A young deckhand nudged his friend and then, gathering courage, met Charles's eyes. In that moment, admiration and relief shone bright in the boy's gaze, proof that Charles's leadership had truly saved them all. Charles glanced at his younger crewmates. He could feel their excitement, but said nothing, focusing instead on the hot meal laid out before him. Outside, the ship glided into the harbor, drawing the startled eyes of townspeople, dockhands, and merchants. Whispers spread among the crowd. Where had this mysterious fourth vessel come from, and what were those colossal creatures trailing behind the ships? In these waters, nearly 30-meter-long sea kings were living legends, monsters so vast that any ordinary merchantman or fishing boat meeting one met certain doom. No one had ever managed to hunt, much less slay, a Neptune. Yet here they were, 4 towering carcasses, tethered like beasts of burden behind the fleet. The moment the gangplank clattered down, Charles was out of his chair and onto the dock. Waiting for him was Ivan, flanked by 24 broad-shouldered men in black suits. Behind them stood 5 elegant attendants, their posture perfect and eyes fixed on their returning master. Ivan stepped forward, bowing deeply. "Boss, how was the voyage? I heard the haul was extraordinary. You're back sooner than expected." Charles set aside his chopsticks and casually flicked a slender toothpick between his fingers. With a nod of his head, he pointed toward the massive Sea King carcasses still bobbing gently in the water behind the ships. Charles stepped ashore, brushing sea spray from his hair as he spoke over his shoulder. "Not a bad haul. We took down 4 8-meter Sea Kings and captured a pirate vessel. Once you've severed the pirate captain's head, bring it to the nearby G branch and collect our reward." Ivan fell into step behind him, silently ticking off every instruction in his mind. When Charles finished, Ivan looked up. "Understood, boss. I'll have it arranged right away." Thanks to Charles's recent exploits, the Wild Wolf gang had grown by leaps and bounds. With so many new recruits, Charles no longer needed to oversee every little detail. That was why Ivan was there. "All right," Charles said, shaking off his coat. "Send someone to prepare dinner. I'm going to take a shower." Ivan nodded, and catching the eye of the queen and her 5 handmaidens, signaled them to head back to the villa. The women curtsied and hurried off. As Charles and Ivan made their way down the bustling docks, townspeople and merchants tipped their hats and called out greetings. "Mr. Charles, well done on those Sea Kings." "Mr. Charles, the mayor's asking for you." Charles smiled and waved, accustomed to the attention. Just as they turned onto the main street leading home, a uniformed security officer stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Mr. Charles," the guard said, voice low and respectful, "the mayor requests your presence at the town hall." Charles knew this man well. Through his run-ins with the Wild Wolf gang, their paths had crossed more than once. So when the security captain called out, "The mayor wants to see you," Charles paused, eyebrows raised in surprise. The island's mayor had never shown him any courtesy before. After all, it was Charles who had slain the pirates who'd been terrorizing Kame Island, and the mayor had flatly refused to meet him afterward. Why summon him now? Curiosity won out. Charles gave Evie and a fellow officer, a quick nod, then fell in step behind the captain as they made their way through the winding streets. Minutes later, they slipped into a quiet corner cafe. Charles scanned the room, but saw no sign of the mayor. Instead, at a small table draped with lace, sat a middle-aged man, sparkling with jewels. The captain bowed low and backed away. Charles crossed his arms. "Who are you?" A warm laugh rippled through the cafe. "I've long heard tales of Kame Island's hero," the man said, voice smooth as silk. "It's an honor to finally meet you. I am Randolph Chamberlain, the new mayor of Kame Island." "Pleasure to meet you, hero of Kame Island," Randolph Chamberlain said, rising from his seat and extending his hand toward Charles. Charles hesitated for a moment as he studied the outstretched hand, then smiled and clasped it firmly. Chapter 13. Charles extended his hand to Randolph Chamberlain, and the moment their skin met, an unexpected jolt shot through his mind. He glimpsed the Chamberlain's private thoughts as if they were written on a page. That boy, the celebrated hero of Kame Island, so young and green. I hope he doesn't wreck my scheme. Charles forced himself to remain expressionless. "Good afternoon, Mr. Chamberlain," he said smoothly, holding Chamberlain's hand firmly. Chamberlain's eyelids fluttered in surprise. He tried to pull away, but Charles simply tightened his grip. Masking his irritation with a thin smile, Chamberlain let his hand stay put. "I wanted to ask about the former mayor," Charles continued. "Do you know where he went?" Randolph rubbed his chin, glittering annoyance barely concealed. Inwardly, he muttered, "Why is this kid full of questions? How would I know where that old man disappeared to?" Yet out loud, he adopted a carefully thoughtful tone. "He retired and handed the office to you when he felt he'd grown too old," Chamberlain said. "After that, I heard he set off on a trip. Truth be told, though, he swindled me out of a hefty sum, millions of Baileys, and vanished. Haven't laid eyes on him since." He finished with a discreet scowl. Charles at last released the Chamberlain's hand and exhaled in relief, grateful to end the awkward exchange without giving away his ability to read minds. Charles's heart pounded as he stared at the Chamberlain. Could this man really have murdered the old mayor? If so, Charles swore he would avenge him. After all, it was the late mayor who'd taken him in and shown him kindness when he was just a boy. Then, why did the mayor call for me? Charles found himself asking. The Chamberlain's expression softened into an ingratiating smile. "Ah, there's no dark purpose, I assure you. I simply wish to welcome the heroes of Kame Island now that I've assumed office. I wanted the chance to make your acquaintance and to ensure we can work together in the days to come." He extended a pudgy hand, and Charles shook it, the Chamberlain's genuine eagerness, or so it seemed, enough to unnerve him. If Charles hadn't learned to read people's hearts long ago, he might have been taken in by the Chamberlain's flattery. But then the Chamberlain dropped the bomb. "I serve under Umis, King of the Sea. His orders are to open the route's second half, and this island stands as our checkpoint." At that name, King of the Sea, Charles's blood ran cold. The Sea King was one of the fabled 6 underground kings of the Dark World, the shadowy overlords whose ambitions spanned continents. If Umis truly had set his sights on Kame Island, it could spell grave danger for them all. Charles's frown deepened, and for a heartbeat, the Chamberlain froze. "Did I say something amiss, sir?" he asked nervously. Charles let the silence stretch, mind racing with possibilities. The Chamberlain's polite veneer was cracking, revealing the weight of dark powers poised at the island's gates. Now Charles understood the true reason for this meeting. Not courtesy, but conquest. And he knew he would need every ally he could find to protect the only home he'd ever known. Charles grinned and let go of the mayor's hand. "Pardon me," the mayor said with a chuckle, quickly reclaiming his hand and guiding Charles toward a pair of chairs. "Distracted again, I see." Charles settled opposite him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Sorry about that. I was just thinking." "As long as it's nothing urgent," the mayor replied, waving off his concern. He tapped his heavily ringed fingers against his chest. "But remember, if you ever need anything, trivia or crisis, you come straight to me." Charles offered a small bow of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll keep that in mind." The mayor's eyes gleamed as he raised his glass. "That reminds me, 2 days from now, I'm hosting a banquet. I insist you attend as our honored guest, Kame Island's very own hero." Consider it done, Charles said easily. He already understood the mayor's real agenda, to turn the island into a vital Sea King shipping hub, and with Charles's name behind the plan, approvals would sail through without a hitch. They clinked glasses, conversed a few more minutes, then rose to go their separate ways. Charles stepped out of the cafe into the cool afternoon air, his mind already racing ahead to the banquet and the next steps in the island's destiny. Charles staggered up the street, surprised to find the coffee shop serving red wine. After 4 years since his unexpected leap through time, this was his very first taste of alcohol, and in a cafe of all places. No wonder he was a little tipsy. "Master! Boss!" As soon as he arrived at the villa, the 5 young maids and Even rushed to his side. Their prompt attention sobered Charles almost instantly. Embarrassed by how close 2 of the maids were standing, he felt his cheeks flush. "You've made it home all right?" one maid asked, steadying him under each arm. Charles nodded, avoiding Ivan's gaze, and, insisting he was fine, pulled himself upright. With the 2 maids supporting him, he shuffled toward his bedroom. The other 3 maids watched, their faces bright red. Ivan looked equally uncomfortable. "You 3, please wait outside," Ivan said gently, ushering them away. As the only man in the household staff, he felt it inappropriate to stay in a private room alone with their master. The 3 remaining maids stood by the closed door, peeking nervously through the keyhole as muffled voices drifted out. The next morning, Charles awoke with a pounding head. He sat up, rubbing his temples. "Ouch! I really overdid it last night." He winced, still dizzy from the unexpected indulgence in that little cafe. After 4 long years, a single glass of red wine had turned into firmly planted regret, and a story he'd never lived down. Charles woke with a start to the unmistakable feeling of 2 slippery hands groping his chest. In a panic, he grabbed for their wrists and snapped on the bedside lamp. Martha and Jenny, his 2 personal maids, lay on either side of him, their once pristine uniforms in tatters. What on earth had happened last night? Instinctively, Charles yanked the quilt aside and immediately froze as the stark exposure registered. His cheeks burned crimson. In the same instant, Martha and Jenny stirred, blinking groggily up at him. Realization dawned on their faces, and they too flushed bright red. Neither had a single scrap of clothing left. "Get dressed, quickly!" Charles blurted, his voice rough. He snatched at his discarded shirt, pulled it on, then hurried into his trousers and waistcoat as the 2 maids scrambled for their own clothes. All 3 moved in a flurry of embarrassment. At the door, Charles found 3 other maids waiting with wash basins, towels, and soaps. He squared his shoulders and spoke coolly. "Take Martha and Jenny inside. Clean them both thoroughly, no exceptions." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and strode down the corridor, leaving the 3 assistants blinking after him in stunned silence. Charles slipped quietly out of the villa, leaving the 3 maids behind as they shot envious glances at the 2 girls still lounging on the bed. No one followed him, only the long sword hanging at his hip. He needed composure. Last night's events burned vividly in his mind, and he had to steel himself against the shock of it all. In his past life, he'd been a 30-something bachelor, never once imagining he'd find himself entangled with 2 women at once. Reaching the beach, he drew his sword and let loose all the tension coiled inside him. Each swing sent ripples of sword aura shimmering along the shore, gouging a dozen deep furrows in the sand. Before long, the incoming tide erased every trace of his fury. After a few more casual cuts, his racing heart began to slow, and a rare calmness washed over him, as if stripping away every worry in the world. Then something changed. Charles's eyes narrowed, and he felt power welling up from his dantian, an undeniable, towering force that pushed outward in a palpable wave. He hadn't summoned that aura since his last uncontrolled outburst. Not because he didn't want to, but because he feared he couldn't manage it. Yet here it was again, released in spite of him. Charles steadied his breath, bracing himself for whatever came next. Charles quickly quelled the thoughts racing through his mind, and felt a surge of arrogant power course through him. He made a silent vow to lock this sensation in his memory, so that next time he could call on it at will. Chapter 14. Charles stood on the shore, sweat beading at his brow, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had held that domineering aura for what felt like an eternity. Just as the invisible pressure began to fade, his eyes snapped open. Once more, an overwhelming force radiated from him, stronger than before. The air quivered, sending ripples through the waves and rattling the coconut fronds overhead. A few startled fish washed ashore, their scales glinting dully in the sun. Charles could only watch them thrash for a moment before they lay still on the sand. A triumphant laugh burst from his lips. "I'm such a genius," he declared, voice ringing across the beach. With a simple thought, he released the aura, and the world settled back into peaceful calm. Only the fish, now motionless on the shore, bore witness to his display of power. Charles raised his long sword and gripped it tightly, excitement coursing through his veins. "Finally, I can control this domineering presence at will. I've taken another step toward the realm of the strong," he murmured, half to himself. He swung the blade in broad, confident arcs. Each motion sent streaks of sword chi slicing through the air, carving invisible lines that shimmered briefly before vanishing. Charles noticed something new. The sword chi reached farther with every strike, the ethereal blades growing longer, more potent. Encouraged, he redoubled his efforts, each slash more vigorous than the last. The sand beneath his feet scattered, kicked up by the force of his movements. Waves of energy pulsed outward, then recoiled, only to surge again under his will. He fought on relentlessly, pushing his body and spirit to the brink until exhaustion began to tug at his limbs. Still, he persevered, determined to master this newfound power. Time slipped away unnoticed as Charles trained, each passing moment bringing him closer to his goal of becoming truly formidable. Chapter 1. By the lunar calendar, it was now 1480, and for more than a year, Charles had forsaken the mountain trails to train every dawn on the island's wind-swept beach. His decision felt prophetic. The seas had grown lawless, plagued by relentless raids from the dreaded Rocks pirates. Nearly every other month, a fresh band of corsairs would thunder into the port, looting warehouses and terrorizing townsfolk until Charles and his small squad intervened. One by one, the pirates fell beneath his blade, leaving behind their severed heads as grisly proof and ransoms to claim. Outwardly anonymous, Charles sent his loyal brothers ashore in disguise to collect the bounties, ensuring no one suspected the identity of the mysterious pirate slayer. Thanks to his covert crusade, the island enjoyed a peace unseen in recent memory. Word spread that safe passage to Umis lay only across these waters, and merchants shifted their sea lanes through Charles's harbor. Over the past 5 years, the population had swelled from barely 1,000 souls to over 7,000, many refugees fleeing the second half of the New World, each rescued and sheltered by Charles's emerging sanctuary. Today, no tavern or market stall is without someone whispering his name. In every hushed voice, reverence mingles with awe, for Charles has become both shield and savior of this island, a hero forged by sand, steel, and the ceaseless roar of the sea. Chamberlain, the Sea King's lieutenant, watched Charles execute the captured pirate with cold efficiency. His lips tightened into a thin line. Clearly, he had been itching to debate strategy and regulations as soon as the fight ended. But Charles refused to entertain any more discussion. With a curt wave toward his quartermaster, Ivan, he said, "If you have questions, take them up with Ivan. I have other matters to attend to." Chamberlain's dark eyes flicked from Charles to Ivan, then back again, as if weighing whether to protest. In the end, he bowed stiffly and withdrew, casting a wary glance at Charles's blade before slipping away down the gangplank. Pirate raids in these waters had become more frequent and more brutal over the past months. Charles knew he couldn't personally chase every band of marauders who dared to strike at coastal merchants. That was why, late last year, he'd handpicked over 50 men from among his loyal brothers and grateful former slaves he'd rescued. Employing his own naval expertise and an almost instinctive authority, he'd shaped them into a cohesive unit. On one day each week, they drilled under his watchful eye, mastering swordplay, half-boarding tactics, and the Navy's 6 signature combat styles. Most recruits thrived. A handful, 5 or 6, proved unable to keep pace and were quietly reassigned. But the rest had each mastered at least one of the official forms, earning their place among Charles's emerging fleet. When the time came to patrol the trade routes, they would be his vanguard, ready to repel pirates or take the offensive if needed. Charles also recognized that a ship's strength depended as much on its navigators, carpenters, and surgeons as on its swordsmen, so he selected a smaller group from his 50 to study chart reading, rigging, basic medicine, and other essentials of seamanship. To source the best teachers and secure experienced boatmen, he planned to call on Chamberlain's connections. After all, as the Sea King's lieutenant, Chamberlain knew every navigator, shipwright, and barber surgeon along the coast. Brushing a strand of dark hair from his eyes, Charles gazed out over the restless sea. Pirate forces were growing bolder by the week. His men would need every ounce of skill and every ally they could muster to hold the line. But with this handful of trained fighters and the experts he would recruit through Chamberlain, Charles felt ready. The next time the pirates came knocking, they would find his ships prepared and his crew unfaltering. Charles understood that a skilled navigator was the linchpin of any sea voyage. He asked Ivan to select a few trusted men for intensive training under the island's master navigator, and he arranged for several ship's doctors to teach basic nautical skills to his dozen or so household maids. Over the past year, Charles had liberated scores of trafficked slaves, many of them women who would otherwise have been destitute, and taken them into his service. On this small island, seasoned boatmen and cooks were always on hand. At his command, he could summon a dozen sailors and chefs in an instant. Navigator, cook, boatman, these three roles were essential for any ocean expedition, and Charles already had them all. Only one thing remained unclaimed: the ship itself. He'd originally planned a modest vessel just over 50 meters long, but the recent surge in pirate activity convinced him that he needed something far larger and more formidable. His reputation as a pirate slayer was spreading fast, and even those under Facialuo's protection no longer dared stand in his way. When word reached the Chamberlain that Charles was commissioning a ship, the Chamberlain pledged his full support. After all, Charles had personally slain more than 1,000 pirates this year alone, a feat already reported to the Sea King. The Sea King's interest in Charles was immediate. As soon as he learned that Charles was only a teenager, he couldn't hide a flicker of excitement. Another prodigy had appeared. Quietly, he instructed his chamberlain to keep his own identity concealed while attending to every one of Charles's needs. In this way, the chamberlain became Charles's invisible benefactor. Whenever Charles asked for a navigator, one was found. When he required special materials, only the very best were delivered. They weren't quite Adam Treasure Tree timber, the most coveted wood in the realm, but they were the finest alternatives available. With ample funds, top-quality supplies, and a growing crew of boatmen at his disposal, Charles moved quickly. He commissioned a massive ship, 20 meters long, 30 meters wide, and soaring to a considerable height, to be built at the port. Construction has just begun and is expected to take a full year to complete. The only real obstacle is manpower. Out of more than 7,000 inhabitants on the island, fewer than 70 are skilled seamen, and only about a dozen of them are currently assigned to Charles's vessel. But Charles is in no rush. He still has 3 years before he sets sail, and that is time enough to assemble the crew he will need. Since mastering armament Haki, Charles's days have fallen neatly into 2 routines: training his younger brother or refining his own Haki. He finds both equally rewarding. His true test came months ago, when a notorious pirate with a bounty in the tens of millions suddenly appeared in the harbor of Kame Island. The moment the pirate set foot on the docks, Charles sensed the man's deep-seated malice. Without hesitation or a single word, Charles launched himself forward and unleashed a Haki-infused slash, an arc of energy 30 meters long, that streaked across the harbor and struck the pirate ship moored hundreds of meters away. The assembled pirates must have believed they'd been wiped out in an instant. Instead, a lone figure on deck vaulted into the path of the blade. With nothing but his bare fists, he intercepted the attack. Though wounds opened across his arms and chest, he never wavered. His unwavering defense sparked genuine curiosity in Charles. Signaling the ship's captain to drop anchor, Charles also waved off the dockworkers, leaving only himself to confront the pirate crew. True to their fearsome reputation, they wasted no time in closing in, ready to prove that a bounty in the tens of millions isn't awarded lightly. Charles stood a few dozen meters offshore as the enemy ship's cannons thundered, unleashing volley after volley aimed at the port. He barely glanced at them. With a casual flick of his sword, each incoming shell shattered in midair, raining fragments into the sea. As he prepared for the next attack, a sudden chill crept over him. Autumn still held 2 months before winter's arrival, so why did he feel so cold? Chapter 15, Armed Colored Domineering. A sharp chill swept over the harbor as Charles watched the pirate ship draw near. Even at a distance, he could feel an unnatural cold seeping from its timbers. Before long, a thin sheet of ice crept across the water at the vessel's prow, far too deliberate to be mere winter weather. Devil fruit power, no doubt. Charles's pulse quickened. Admiral Aokiji, famed for his icy assaults, was known never to have eaten a devil fruit. Yet this frost was all too real. Could this captain be a former ice logia user? If so, Charles knew he was in for a fight beyond ordinary steel and gunpowder. The pirates swung onto the dock in loose formation, blades in hand and muskets slung at their shoulders. They fanned out around Charles, their eyes cold and calculating. Last of all stepped their captain, a tall man in a weather-beaten cap that cast his face in shadow, his coat trimmed with frost. He surveyed Charles with a slow, disdainful nod. "That brat's got spirit," the captain growled, voice low and gravelly. He flicked a gauntleted hand toward Charles's sword. "But spirit won't save you." Ice crackled beneath their boots as the wind howled. Charles steadied himself, feeling the hum of power gathering in his chest. He braced his sword before him, not just with steel, but with the steely force of his own secret, armed, colored, domineering. In that frozen moment, man faced man, and the first sparks of dominion in the cold air foretold a battle neither would soon forget. "You made that slash just now." The pirate captain's lips curved into a cold smile as he spoke, and Charles braced himself. "Yes," Charles replied, stepping forward. "That was me. Pirates are not welcome here." The captain blinked in surprise, then burst into uproarious laughter. "Ha! Kid, are you serious? You're the only boy known to wield a hero's slash. Just woke up from a nap, did you?" His challenge ignited more laughter among the 50 or so pirates crowded around him. "This is priceless," one of them jeered. "He actually tells us we're unwelcome. Pirates can go wherever we want. Who gave him the right to decide?" Charles remained perfectly calm. He raised his hand, and without another word, a radiant blade of sword energy, nearly 30 meters long, swept across the deck toward the mocking crew. Boom! Before anyone could react, more than 30 pirates were cut down. A stunned hush fell over the ship. The only sound was the unmistakable gulp of a pirate swallowing hard. Then, in the sudden silence, someone shouted, "Retreat! Back to the ships!" Charles's blade cut a clean arc through the air, and the pirates instinctively fell back behind their captain, glancing at him with wide, nervous eyes. "Don't think I'm blind, kid," their captain snapped, frowning as he sized up Charles's skill. He stepped forward, forcing his voice to sound casual. "How would you like to join the chill pirates? Swear your sword to us now, and I'll forget all about your little stunt." Charles raised an eyebrow, then threw back his head and laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "You've got to be joking. Who do you think you are, offering me a place on your crew?" In that instant, a palpable force radiated from Charles, as if the very air acknowledged his challenge. Invisible pressure rolled outward like a shockwave, rattling the boards under the pirates' feet. "Ugh!" came a stifled groan from just behind their captain. One by one, the pirates crumpled to the deck, clutching their heads. The captain whirled around, aghast. His jaw dropped. This is arrogance," he stammered, turning back to Charles with newfound respect and fear. You're a rare one in a million, a born king of arms." Charles sheathed his sword with a single fluid motion and met the captain's stunned stare coolly. "Save your flattery. I'm nobody's recruit." He stepped forward, ready for whatever came next, his confidence unshakable. Captain Will, Chill Werner, ground his teeth. He couldn't let Charles get away with that insult. He refused to believe a mere brat could best him. Murdero's intent blazed in his eyes as white smoke curled around his clenched fists, a chilling wind spiraling outward. "Boy, you're courting death," he snarled and lunged forward. Charles had seen that opening before. He noted in surprise that this pirate could wield the Navy's six-style technique, but he gave no sign of panic. He lifted his longsword and met the captain's charging fist head-on. "Armament Haki!" he shouted. Clang! Steel rang against hardened knuckles, sparks flying in every direction. Instantly, Charles recognized the inky aura enveloping the pirate's hand, proof of mastered armament Haki. Captain Werner laughed, voice echoing with madness. "So you know it? That's the Marine's armament Haki for you. I'm Will Werner, nicknamed Chill, with a 6 billion Bailey bounty on my head. Consider yourself lucky. You'll die by my hand." Charles stood firm, unshaken by the captain's roar. Yet all the while, one word kept echoing in his mind. "Chill?" Charles frowned as he watched Will Werner unleash his power. Isn't his devil fruit ability a cold fruit, not a freezing fruit? If that's the case, then why all this fear? With a quick flourish, Charles forced Will Werner back with his blade, then swung again. A 10-meter arc of shimmering sword energy slammed into the air where Will had been standing. Bam! Will Werner's arm flared with a lattice of the arm domination technique, intercepting the attack, but the sword energy still sheared through his guard, carving a deep cut across the shimmering grid. Charles couldn't help but laugh triumphantly. He intended to capture Will Werner alive and steal the secret to the arm domination cultivation method. His own body was strong enough now. All that remained was to master that domineering style. Will Werner's arrival on the battlefield was a godsend. He finally had the key to fill that last gap in his training. Fueled by excitement, Charles pressed his advantage. He waved his sword in a deadly dance of light, driving Will Werner backward and never giving him a moment's rest. As a devil fruit user, Charles could strike from a distance, and Will had no chance to close the gap. The battlefield echoed with the clash of steel and the roar of power, Charles's eyes blazing with anticipation. He would not let this opportunity slip away. Charles had been foolish to pick a fight with him. Damn it, this kid! Will Werner reeled under the sword's aura. His own overbearing armament hadn't yet matured enough to shroud more than a fingertip, let alone withstand such raw power. Before he could mount a proper defense, Charles's blade slashed his chest. Instinctively, Will activated his devil fruit ability, sealing the wound in ice and staunching the bleeding. Charles, however, withdrew his sword aura, not because he'd exhausted it, but out of caution. As a novice, he dared not cut too deep and accidentally kill his quarry. He still needed to find a master who could help him fully cultivate his overbearing armament. Behind Will lay his fallen crew, all incapacitated. There was no escape. Panic tangled his thoughts. Staring at Charles, hopelessness clouded his eyes until, with a roar, he hurled himself forward in a last-ditch, reckless charge. Luck had already turned its back on him. Charles slid aside with effortless grace. In a single fluid motion, his sword flashed, severing both of Will's arms and shattering the tendons in his legs. Red spurted across the deck as Will Werner collapsed, blood bubbling at his lips and darkness flooding his vision. Will Werner's anguished roar ripped through the air, his most painful cry yet. Even Charles winced at the sound. He knew all too well that his own pride and cold detachment had led him to feel no sympathy for Werner's plight. With a quiet shake of his head, he banished the flicker of guilt and squared his shoulders, fixing his gaze on the fallen man before him. Werner lay crippled, helpless, and a slow, predatory smile spread across Charles's face. He drew in a steadying breath, fingertips brushing the hilts of his weapons. This was Tastor, the moment he'd been waiting for. Armed and unrelenting, he was ready to assert his dominance. Chapter 16. Leng Leng Fruit. Under the horrified stares of the onlookers, Charles's large hand clamped down on Will Werner's head. In an instant, his martial domination aura flared, filling the air with raw, oppressive power. "Where did you cultivate this martial domination aura?" Charles asked, his voice calm but unyielding. Will's body ached under the pressure. He couldn't bring himself to speak, yet the answer was already clear to him. He was no ordinary cultivator. Only a year ago, he had emerged from the distant West Sea and broken into the second half of the Great Route with astonishing speed. His secret? The moment he slew a rear admiral, he claimed the admiral's private training manual. Hidden within its pages were the techniques for not only the martial domination aura, but also the knowledge domination method, and the 6 legendary naval combat stances. Thanks to his natural talent, Will had grasped the fundamentals of both domination auras within months. But a year of tireless practice still hadn't cracked their deeper mysteries. The aura he now radiated was the product of countless sacrifices, and a testament to his refusal to remain ordinary. Though he remained silent, Will's clenched teeth and the tremor in his limbs spoke volumes. Charles nodded slowly, satisfied. The heart of the secret lay bare. Will Werner's fearsome power had come from that stolen manual and the unrelenting drive to master its forbidden arts. Charles surveyed the 6 naval cadets with mild amusement. They'd been given only the most basic training, barely enough to polish their boots and shave neatly, let alone face real combat. That realization seemed to astonish him. Drawing on the raw power of his new domineering armed chi technique, he focused all his strength into a single but devastating strike. Will Werner, caught entirely off guard, went rigid with terror. In an instant, Charles's blow shattered his defenses. Werner's eyes bulged, and his body crumpled under the force. Silence flooded the dock for a heartbeat. Then the other 20 or so pirates scattered at the far end, tumbled like dominoes under Charles's next commands. With a calm wave of his hand, Charles signaled his own fighters, young men he'd personally trained, to finish the job. They surged forward, long blades flashing, and in moments the pirates lay disarmed and defeated. Charles turned away from the carnage and strode toward the pirate ship moored alongside the quay, his one indulgence after every battle, the hunt for treasure. He climbed aboard with the easy confidence of someone who knew the vessel's layout from memory, the same layout Werner had once described. In the captain's cabin, Charles opened the desk drawer without hesitation. Inside lay a leather-bound journal stamped with a naval emblem, the rear admiral's log. He slipped it into his coat pocket, then rifled through the other drawers and the bedside table, searching for anything else of value. Mission accomplished, he prepared to depart as silently as he'd arrived. As expected of pirates from the Western Sea, their skill far outstrips any crew carrying bounties under X million. Charles watched as Bailey hauled 3 enormous suitcases onto the dock and estimated their contents must be worth at least X million. Having finished his thorough search of the ship's cabins, he stepped out onto the pier. Already, life was returning to the port. Dock workers, merchants, and curious townsfolk tentatively returned, only to stop dead at the sight of 60 or 70 bodies strewn across the planks. Awe and gratitude rippled through the crowd at the boy who had outwitted so many vicious pirates. Just then, the mayor emerged from the mayor's office, flanked by the chamberlain. Thank you, Mr. Charles, for saving the people of Kamei Island. You are our hero." The chamberlain practically swept Charles into a fervent handshake. Charles could only stand there, speechless. If he hadn't known the truth behind their enthusiasm, he might have believed his own legend. A chorus of "Hero, hero" rose from the landers, and an unexpected swell of pride bloomed in his chest. Before he realized it, he raised a hand in acknowledgement and offered the broadest, most confident smile he could muster. Charles cursed under his breath. Damn these emotions, always catching me unawares. He forced a calm wave at the bustling crowd and slipped away from the market square. As he hurried along the stalls, one fruit vendor caught his eye. Among the neatly piled pears sat a single fruit, etched with strange swirling patterns. "Mr. Charles, over here!" the stall owner cried, leaning forward in excitement. Charles paused. The vendor hurried over, heart racing. "How much for these pears? I'd like a few." A small, cool smile flickered across Charles's face. "On the house. Take whatever you like. No charge." The fruit seller froze, astonished. "For me? Thank you, Mr. Charles." He watched Charles fill a paper bag with half a dozen pears, carefully slipping the patterned one into the mix, eyes wide with admiration, as Charles turned and walked away. Back at his villa, Charles entered the kitchen and calmly instructed the staff to begin preparing supper. Once the orders were given, he retreated to his private study. There, amid shadowed shelves, he retrieved the wrapped pear with the curious markings. With deliberate care, he peeled back the paper and revealed its secret, a devil fruit. He held it in both hands, its surface gleaming like rippling ice. "The cold fruit," he whispered, recalling the name of its last owner, Will Werner. "My first devil fruit sighting in the 5 years since I arrived in this world." Heart pounding, Charles studied the fruit's swirling patterns, already imagining the power it might grant and the dangers it would surely bring. The devil fruit lay untouched in Charles's hand. He had no intention of eating it himself. He'd reserve it for one of his subordinates. Carefully, he placed it in the safe and locked the door behind him. Returning to the sofa, Charles withdrew the leather-bound notebook from his coat. He opened it and began to read. The training methods inside were astonishingly thorough. A single glance made clear the intricacies of the Navy's sixth form techniques. Forms he'd once practiced vaguely thanks to his past life memories, but never truly understood. With this manual, however, his power could grow exponentially. Flipping ahead, he found the section on armed domineering. As he absorbed the instructions, it hit him. This wasn't just brute force, but a perfect fusion of mind, body, and technique. With the right physique and disciplined cultivation, he could unleash the full might of armament Haki. Satisfied, Charles snapped the notebook shut. That evening, as the last light faded, Charles decided against testing the new technique until morning. It was too dark to practice safely. He slipped back inside to fetch his gear, and found Ivan waiting just beyond the door. "Boss," Ivan reported, breathless, "my brother's already handed over the Chill Pirates captain, Will Werner, for his bounty. He should be back in custody by tomorrow. And we've seized a haul of Bailey coins from the ship, 3 billion in total." He dumped a heavy sack at Charles's feet. "It's all here," Charles nodded. "Good work. Use that money to reward everyone who saw action today. As for our next step, take this." He handed Ivan a slim, leather-bound volume. "The 6th Naval Style's already imprinted on my mind. You won't need this again." Ivan accepted the manual eagerly. "Understood, boss." "Make 10 perfect copies," Charles continued. "Tomorrow, I want every fighter drilling through all 6 naval forms. In a few years, we'll see real mastery." Ivan's eyes shone. "Yes, sir. I'll get the copies made right away, and I'll only send our strongest men to sea. No weak links." Charles allowed himself a small smile. "Exactly, dismissed." With that, Ivan hefted the sack of coins in the precious manual, already plotting the next day's training. Charles watched him go, anticipation sparking in his chest. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Everyone will begin training according to this plan tomorrow. I guarantee you'll see real results within a year. Ivan nodded in acknowledgement, but Charles simply waved him off. Assigning each of the 6 naval combat styles to one student for a full year already far exceeded his expectations. After all, among more than 50 combatants, only about 10 were likely capable of mastering even a single style in that time. Charles hadn't hoped for much more from them. Chapter 17. The Rocks Pirates, May 1480, Lunar Calendar. Charles practiced his swordplay on the windswept shore when a sudden flutter of alarm seized him. His heart pounded unnaturally. He froze mid-strike, blade poised, scanning the empty sea, but saw nothing. Still, the unease would not relent. Then, from the horizon, cannon fire boomed like thunder. It was joined by crashing timbers, the clash of steel, and distant screams. A colossal warship, black-clad and bristling with cannons, cut through the waves toward a battered naval squadron. Smoke and flame curled skyward. High on the pirate vessel's quarterdeck stood its captain, a towering red-haired man known only as Rocks. His icy gaze swept over the carnage without a flicker of emotion. Around him, his crew roared their approval. "Gwahaha! Another Navy detachment in ruins!" Rocks shouted, laughter booming across the water. Once this stronghold falls, the Navy's stranglehold on the Grand Line's second half is broken. Beside him loomed Whitebeard Newgate, a colossal figure nearly 7 meters tall. He gripped a blade so massive it seemed more like a ship's gangplank. A cruel grin split his face. Rocks is right. Soon this sea will belong entirely to pirates. A 2-meter swordsman, twin blades gleaming and cigar clenched between his teeth, gave a low chuckle. They'll regret ever challenging the Rocks pirates. Charles's grip tightened on his hilt. Whatever storm was brewing on that deck, he felt certain it would change the balance of power at sea, and perhaps shape his own destiny as well. The deck erupted in desperate shouts. "Captain Shiki, our men are trapped in the current. Get them out of there!" "Help! Captain Shiki! Somebody, help!" Marines will never fail to enforce justice. Pirates and Marines alike cried out as the swirling lion-head blades, Shiki's trademark, closed in around them. A frantic pirate officer called up to the Golden Lion himself. "Shiki, if you keep this up, every one of our crews will drown." Edward Newgate, who would one day be known as Whitebeard, glanced at the turmoil with a frown. Though his beard was still far darker than the pure white of his later legend, streaks of silver had already begun to appear. Next to him stood the mighty golden lion Shiki, his hair gleaming like molten gold in the sunlight. Shiki laughed, a low, rumbling sound that carried easily across the water. Ah! A crew that can't endure even one of my attacks doesn't deserve to sail under my flag, and there are plenty more small-time pirates in the sea. Why mourn these? No one dared argue. Even Newgate fell silent under Shiki's fierce gaze. Within moments, the entire G8 Marine Squadron was swept away by the Golden Lion's power, disappearing beneath the waves as though it had never existed. Only 10 pirate ships remained afloat, each one laden with plunder, heading home with their holds overflowing. Shiki stretched out his arms, triumphant. All right, lads, set course for home. Is there any nearby island where we can restock our supplies? The red-haired quartermaster Rox glanced at Navigator Shachi. Show me. Shachi spread the charts across the table and pointed to a speck on the edge of their map. There's an island here big enough for 1,000 people. According to my sources, a single man holds it, and he's deadly. In the past year, any pirate foolish enough to approach has been cut down, their heads delivered to the Navy branch for the bounty. Rox raised an eyebrow. One man? How strong could he be? Golden Lion Shiji, leaning on the rail and puffing on his cigar, snorted. Strong enough to unleash sword slashes that cleave through steel. His name is Charles, a young swordsman whose reputation sends even the bravest to their graves. And don't forget, this island sits under the influence of Umi's 6 kings of the underworld. Shaf frowned at the reports in his hands. Umi's 6 kings? You mean that underworld syndicate? Exactly, Shiji replied, flicking ash into the water. A council of 6 crime lords who control every tech hing beneath the waves. They don't tolerate trespassers. The navigator leaned back, running a hand through his hair. A prodigy swordsman backed by the 6 kings. No wonder no ship dares to anchor there. Go take a look. Rox D. Zebek leaned forward, curiosity sparking in his eyes. The pirate lord, ever fond of recruiting extraordinary talents, found himself intrigued by whatever was unfolding on that island. It's him, came a shout from the crow's nest. Shanks, at his side, caught the signal. Helm, starboard turn, now, he barked. Simultaneously, he raised his voice to the rest of the fleet of 10 ships. Prepare yourselves, we've got a new contender on our hands. A booming laugh answered him. On the quarterdeck, Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself, swirled the last drops of wine in his cup before lifting it in a mock toast. A contender? He rumbled, amusement dancing in his eyes. If you can't withstand a single strike from me, you're not fit to call yourself an ally of the Golden Lion Shiki. Golden Lion Shiki bristled at the insult, hissing in scorn, but Newgate merely sipped his wine and ignored him. Shiki, unable to provoke any further reaction, turned his back in silent ire. Below deck, Captain Locke stood at the bow, his gaze fixed on the rolling waves as if searching the horizon for a hidden omen. Within moments, the fleet had shifted course and set sail for Kame Island. On the island's pier, Charles remained rooted to the spot, dread tightening his chest. Islanders milled around him, puzzled by his rigid stance, but he paid them no mind. Mouth dry, heart hammering, he stared out to sea, bracing himself for whatever unknown danger was fast approaching. Charles let a wry smile tug at his lips as the frustrated murmur of the crowd died away. They were about to dismiss him again. Perfect. Seizing the moment, he bellowed, "Everyone, up the mountain, right now! Pirates are coming." He planted himself at the edge of the pier, adopting the calm, confident stance that had saved this town more times than anyone could count. From his vantage point, he could just make out the masts of a vast fleet cresting the horizon. At first, the dock workers and merchants exchanged puzzled glances. The sea's surface was glassy. There was nothing obvious to see. But Charles didn't hesitate. "Hurry! Dozens of them, closing fast," he shouted. Those who knew Charles, folks he had rescued time and again, didn't pause. Without a word, they dropped their nets and crates and sprinted toward the winding trail that led up into the hills behind town. Others stood their ground. Visiting traders, strangers to Charles's reputation, scoffed at the notion of a boy crying wolf. "No ships in sight," one barked, waving a dismissive hand at the dock hands scrambling past him. "Stay put. Let him run off at the mouth." A tense silence fell. The only sound was the distant clang of a bell at the lookout tower, warning those farther along the coast. Charles held his breath, heart hammering. He could see them now. Black hulls cutting through the water, sails unfurled like ominous wings. His eyes blazed. Whether they believed him or not, Charles would protect his town, and he'd prove to every doubter that when danger came, the boy who warned them was no fool. Chapter 18. The dockworkers, ordinary townsfolk all, took Charles at his word and fled the pier in a frantic rush. A few stragglers lingered, but there was no point in warning them again. He had made it clear that anyone who stayed risked their life. One by one, even the hardiest souls scurried away until only a handful remained, faces pale with dread. Charles stood at the water's edge, jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon. At first the crowd saw only a distant black speck, but as it drew closer, dread rippled through the few onlookers. 10 massive ships were bearing down on the harbor, each hull painted pitch dark, and atop the largest flew the unmistakable pirate skull flag. Merchants and curious spectators pressed back toward safety, but it was already too late. The pirate fleet approached with unnerving speed. From the deck of the lead ship strode a broad-shouldered man known as Golden Lion. A stubby cigar jutted from his mouth, and his laughter boomed across the water. "Ha! So you're the famed swordsman who can cleave the air and leap on the wind? Let's see how well you fight." He raised his curved cutlass, channeling his power into a crackling wave of sword energy that stretched 50 meters and hurtled straight at Charles. The boy's eyes narrowed. "Attacking right off the bat?" he muttered, drawing his own blade as the roaring arc of power closed in. Charles met Shiji's attack without hesitation, unleashing a blade of energy just as massive. The two arcs of sword chi carved through the air and struck each other above the harbor with a thunderous roar. Neither gave an inch. Their colliding forces crackled briefly before dissolving into the sea. On the pier, dozens of onlookers gaped in shock. "How is this possible?" someone whispered. Among them stood the crew of the Rock's pirates, stunned into silence. "Boss Shiji / he couldn't break through? Are there other strong combatants on this island?" a pirate muttered. A few scornful voices rose above the rest. "Pathetic," one sneered. "Boss Shiji's all talk, no power." But those who had witnessed Shiji's true might bristled at the insult. "You fools," one laughed harshly. "Shiji's unstoppable. What's your excuse now?" Edward Newgate himself sneered, his deep voice cutting through the tension. The ridicule stung Shiji like a slap. "You," Shiji snarled, his grip tightening on the hilt of his greatsword. In an instant, his anger ignited. Shiji gathered every ounce of strength into a single, devastating strike. The sea itself trembled as his blade energy, a towering pillar of light, cleaved through the waves and hurtled toward Charles. Charles's eyes narrowed. He steadied his stance, preparing for the onslaught. The final battle had truly begun. Charles gritted his teeth, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "I can't fall back now. If I do, this island will be destroyed." Summoning every last ounce of strength, he swung his blade in a blur of steel, unleashing dozens of rapid arcs at the massive, 100-meter-tall sword energy looming above him. Individually, none of his strikes could rival Shiki the Golden Lion's single devastating blow, but together, they chipped away at it until the towering blade dissolved into nothingness. Even Edward Newgate, the legendary Whitebeard, found himself surprised. He watched with a faint smile and muttered, "This kid's got some serious power." Shiki sheathed his sword, his eyes shining with new respect for Charles's strength. Their ship was now so close that Charles could see the figures standing on its deck. His heart leapt. You're the Rock's pirates." A booming laugh rose from the deck. "Ha! Our reputation precedes us," Shiki declared, stepping forward. His aura pressed against Charles like a living thing. "So tell me, brat, who are you?" Charles felt the weight of Shiki's challenge, but refused to back down. He straightened his shoulders and met the pirate lord's gaze without flinching. "My name is Charles Rockefeller. This is my hometown," Charles declared, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken challenge. The moment he unleashed that commanding aura, the entire crew fell silent. They had assumed he was merely a talented swordsman, nothing more, but this was something else entirely. Even Ling Ling, who'd paid Charles little mind until now, straightened at his display, and Kaido, her ever-loyal shadow, braced himself. Across the deck, the notorious Rox D. Gibbeck, known far and wide as the Golden Lion, allowed a small, approving smile to play at the corner of his mouth. "So you're Rockefeller Charles," the Golden Lion murmured, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Boy, what do you say to joining my fleet? With your gifts, you'd make an outstanding officer." Charles's expression sharpened. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to sail under another man's flag. One day, I'll raise my own crew, and I'll captain it myself." The Golden Lion's grin vanished. He leaned forward, his aura deepening into a tangible weight. "Oh, and just how do you plan to pull that off, boy?" Unfazed, Charles met the pirate lord's gaze and strengthened his own presence in response. His aura flared, warding off the Golden Lion's pressure entirely. Not for a moment did he waver. His resolve shone brighter than any threat before him. "It's going to crack!" Under the crushing glow in the sky, even the most battle-hardened pirates froze, their eyes drawn upward. Edward Newgate chuckled, wine in hand. "Gah! This lad's power is something else." He drained his goblet, slamming it down as a colossal wave of Haki burst from him. Instantly, 3 Overlord-level auras coalesced and clashed high above the ship. The moment Edward's presence joined the fray, Charles Lingling and Kaido exchanged quick, determined glances, and then each unleashed his own devastating willpower. 5 titanic auras now tore at the heavens in a fierce, silent battle. On deck, pirates who had managed to steady themselves moments before now dropped like flies under the onslaught. The weakest were hurled clean overboard. Beneath those invisible, crushing forces, glass panels spider-webbed and wooden beams groaned and split apart. Watching the chaos unfold, Rox threw back his head and roared with delight. "Ha ha ha! Stop it!" Rox D. Gibbeck's aura flared a blood red, crackling with lightning as he drove it out to crush the combined might of his 5 adversaries. For a heartbeat, their bold stances wavered under his onslaught. Then, in perfect unison, the 5 struck back. Their joined force overwhelmed him, and his aura flickered in retreat. Afloat on the bow, Shiachi lounged, cigarette in hand, eyes fixed on the 6 titans below. He exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "What monsters?" he murmured. His companions exchanged grim nods. From their vantage point, Kaido's presence was the lightest of the group. Charles Lingling and Charles matched each other in power. Whitebeard's aura was just a shade stronger than Shiji's. Out front, Shiji bore the full brunt of Rox's redirected force. As expected of the 1st Division captain, Shiachi observed quietly. "He's almost caught up to the captain himself." At that, Rox's face darkened. He realized, with bleak certainty, that his solo might could no longer dominate 5 enemies united against him. Then everything snapped back into place. Rox fixed Charles with a steely glare and said, "You've got 2 options. Enlist with the Rox pirates or die." Charles stood silent, weighing the threat. After a long moment, he squared his shoulders and met Rox's gaze. "Fine," he said coolly. "I'll join." Chapter 19, Captain of the 8th Division. Under Locke's menacing glare, Charles had no choice but to nod. After all, he wanted to live. "Ha! Welcome aboard, Charles," boomed Rox D. Gibbeck, his wide grin splitting his scarred face. Charles forced a stiff smile in return, glancing around the deck. Edward Newgate stood off to one side, expressionless. Nearby, Golden Lion Shiki leaned back, an unlit cigar dangling from his lips. Charlotte Linlin, Big Mom herself, was already tucking into a generous slice of cake, while Kaido loomed behind her like a silent sentinel. Feeling the weight of so many powerful figures watching him, Charles stepped aside to let the others pass. Rox clapped him on the shoulder, clearly satisfied, then vaulted nimbly off the ship's railing. One by one, the rest of the crew followed. They landed on a bustling, sunlit quay. Colorful flags snapped in the breeze, and the air buzzed with the calls of port workers. Rox surveyed the scene with obvious pleasure. "What a fine, prosperous little port," he declared. Charles's heart pounded as he took a cautious step forward. "Captain Gibbeck," he began, voice trembling slightly, "now that I've joined you, would you promise not to harm this island? It's where I grew up." Locke pivoted to face him. Towering over Charles, the giant's cold eyes made him flinch. Then Locke's lips curved into a broad, almost friendly smile. "Of course," he rumbled. "This is your home now." Rox's hand fell heavily on Charles's shoulder. "However," he thundered, stepping closer, his grin widening, and with that single word, the promise of safety hung in the air, tempting, yet laced with the unspoken dangers of a pirate's life. You think I can keep them in line? I can't promise they'll listen to me. You'll have to show them exactly whose orders they're following. Locks glanced back at the 10 warships moored in the harbor. From their decks, 100 or so pirates stared hungrily at the bustling docks and the peaceful town beyond, their eyes alight with greed. Charles met their gazes coolly, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Let any of them so much as try to loot a single home, he said, and they'll find themselves paying for it with their lives. An amused smile curved Lox's lips. Very well, lad. The crew's in your hands. Without another word, Charles drew his long sword in a fluid motion and strode ashore, the steel blade catching the morning sun. 9 pirates were stepping down the gangplank one by one. Charles advanced toward them, unflinching. "Come to plunder?" he called out, voice calm but carrying over the dock. "Then you'll fall before my sword." Lox and his officers stepped back, folding their arms to watch the confrontation. "Ha!" scoffed Golden Lion Shiji, flicking ash from his cigar. "I'd wager this kid won't last half an hour against those scoundrels." Edward Newgate merely turned his gaze on Shiji, expression cool and dismissive, and said nothing. Shiki, the Golden Lion, didn't even flinch. Aside from the legendary Rocks pirates aboard this ship, the only man he ever feared was Edward Newgate. Everyone else was beneath his notice. Had anyone but Charles dared to speak so boldly to him, Shiki would have drawn his sword on the spot. Yet when Charles issued his challenge, the entire crew froze for a heartbeat before erupting into a furious roar. "Boy, who do you think you are?" bellowed a burly pirate, pounding the deck with his iron-tipped cudgel. "Brothers, to me, seize the gold and the women." Steel sang as dozens of blades were drawn in unison. One pirate leveled his flintlock directly at Charles and squeezed the trigger. Bang! 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 A hail of lead tore toward the boy. But Charles merely tilted his head, shifted his weight, and the bullets whizzed past him with almost playful ease. His calm, unwavering confidence showed he feared neither sword nor shot. In fact, the gunfire never stood a chance of hitting Charles. The final volley tore into the deck behind him, splintering the wood at the feet of Shiki's men, the Rocks pirates, who stood ready to protect him. Golden Lion Shiki cocked his head and allowed himself a thin, amused smile. "That brat did it on purpose," he said softly, his eyes gleaming with approval. Edward Newgate swung his fist through the hail of gunfire, and the bullets disintegrated to powder in midair. Beside him, Charles and Kaido didn't even flinch. They simply stood still, letting the rounds strike them. A series of muted cracks echoed as each bullet shattered upon impact and tumbled harmlessly to the deck. "Monsters, both of you," Golden Lion Shiji growled, eyeing them with a mixture of awe and envy. Ordinary people were a rarity on this ship. Everyone here possessed some inhuman edge. There was Edward Newgate, whose veins pulsed with giant's blood, Kaido of the Phantom Clan, and Charles Lingling, dubbed the Steel Balloon for his impenetrable body. Shiji half expected to see one fellow mortal, but no, this vessel sailed nothing but titans. He shifted his gaze to where the battle had just begun. Xiaoluo's sword energy erupted in a wild dance, dozens of razor-sharp slashes slicing the air like fleeing spirits. His face was blank, his chest unmoving, as if the very act of breathing might betray his power. "Damn, this kid's a monster too," Shiji thought, stubbing out his cigar as he fought down a shiver of disbelief. All around him, the others had turned to stare at Charles too. These pirates weren't the sort to throw themselves at him on impulse. Even in their days as overlords, they'd sensed something uncanny about this boy, so they held back. Only the reckless few dared to attack. Charles planted his feet, gripping his sword as a palpable, oppressive energy coiled around the blade. Each sweep of his arm sent a shockwave of force radiating outward, keeping every pirate at least 10 meters away. Limbs and bodies flew across the deck, the air filled with the banshee cries of the wounded. Fueled by a rush of exhilaration, Charles accelerated his strikes until they blurred into a continuous arc, far too swift for the naked eye to follow. Only through mystic sight could one trace the ghostly after-images of his blade. "No, no, I don't want treasure, don't want women," a voice shrieked. One pirate dropped his weapon and bolted for the lifeboat. But Charles's sword moved faster than any man could run. In a single 30-meter arc, he cleaved through the escaping pirates. In an instant, They were swallowed by that rippling blade energy, their desperate flight cut brutally short. Edward Newgate's lips pressed into a thin line. "That boy is savage," he muttered under his breath. "He even butchered those who'd already surrendered." No one around him objected. "Rox D." Seebeck merely watched Charles with a faint, approving smile. The Golden Lion idly puffed his cigar, blowing smoke rings into the night air. Kaido remained stoic, his arms folded across his massive chest. Charles calmly wiped the crumbs of cake from his lips, barely batting an eye at the pools of blood and the heap of bodies piled at the docks. Edward Newgate glanced at him, uneasy. He had joined this crew seeking camaraderie and a sense of belonging, but Charles's ruthless efficiency, especially his disregard for the mercy of surrender, stirred doubts in the old pirate's mind. By the time Charles finally sheathed his sword, more than 400 pirates lay dead, their corpses forming a mountain of carnage. The survivors still aboard the captured ships peered out in terror, their faces pale as they trembled at the docks below. Not a single blade had nicked the hull. Charles's strikes had been precise and controlled, stopping just a meter away from the wood. Edward exhaled a long, shaky breath. Was this truly the crew he wanted to call home? Ignoring the question, Charles strode forward and approached Locks. The young captain's grin spread wider than ever, as though he'd been expecting this display all along. He clasped Charles's right hand firmly, then turned to address the assembled pirates. "Gentlemen," Locks announced, voice booming across the dock. "Our new comrade has demonstrated exactly what it means to be one of us." A ripple of approval ran through the crowd, and as Charles met Locks's gaze, he felt, perhaps for the first time, like he'd found where he truly belonged. "I hereby appoint Charles Rockefeller as captain of the 8th Squadron of the Rocks Pirates, and officially welcome him as one of our cadre." Chapter 20. Navy Headquarters. Rox's voice boomed over the assembled pirates. "Brothers, gather round. By my command, Charles is appointed captain of the 8th Division of the Rocks Pirates." A stunned silence fell across the deck. The rank-and-file pirates stared at Charles in disbelief, then at Captain Locks, who stood grinning at his side. Charles himself blinked, uncertain he'd heard correctly. Locks gave him a hearty clap on the shoulder. "All right, men, let's celebrate our new division commander. Bring out the cups and the banners." Rox threw back his head and laughed. "Ha! A banquet's the finest way to honor a promotion." At once, Golden Lion Shiji roared with approval, and even Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, couldn't help but let a broad grin spread across his weathered face. "Excellent. I do love good cake." All at once, the tension that had knotted Charles's stomach for days slipped away. He laughed, too, genuinely, and felt his pulse quicken with excitement. He was a pirate now, and by the sea's law, had earned this moment of glory. Torches were lit, barrels of rum and wine rolled forward, and the deck filled with raucous music and shouts of approval. Charles found himself swept up in the celebration, clinking mugs, exchanging slaps on the back, and accepting hearty congratulations. He didn't feel an ounce of regret, instead, a fierce pride at having won his place among such notorious company. But in a shadowed corner of the fortress, a lone figure watched him closely. With deft fingers, the stranger slipped a small camera into position and snapped 2 quick photographs of Charles at the center of the feast. The film was tucked away before anyone noticed. Those images would circulate far beyond this celebration, and sooner or later they would reach ears that did not look kindly on pirates. Far to the east, beyond the endless stretch of the blue sea, a massive marine fortress jutted from the waves. Its gray walls bristled with cannon ports, its banners snapped in the wind, bearing the unmistakable symbol of the world government. Within its ramparts, the Navy's high command prepared for news from the front, news that might change the balance of power on the seas forever. The harbor thrummed with activity, rows of warships bobbed at their moorings, while sailors scurried up and down gangways. Then a sharp cry cut through the clamor. "Emergency! All hands report!" A breathless colonel burst through the main gate, clutching a sheaf of papers. He barreled into the admiral's office and halted before the man behind the desk. General Kong Steelbone, the fleet's renowned cyborg commander. "Sir," the colonel panted, slapping the dispatch onto the polished table. The G8 supply branch on the second Great Route was ambushed by the Rocks pirates. "They've been wiped out." No survivors. Steelbone's metal-plated frame stiffened. His crimson optical implant glowed fiercely as he snatched the report and scanned it. G8, destroyed? He slammed the papers down. How did they? Unknown, sir, the colonel replied, swallowing hard. Then there's no time to lose. Summon Fleet Admiral Sengoku, Vice Admiral Garp, and Vice Admiral Crane immediately. At once, sir, the colonel saluted and dashed out. Moments later, 3 officers in their white justice coats entered. Fleet Admiral Sengoku's calm gaze, Vice Admiral Garp's usual grin replaced by a grim line, and Vice Admiral Crane's poised composure all spoke of foreboding news. General Steelbone did not bother with formalities. Explain. Sengoku accepted the dispatch and scanned it swiftly. His brow furrowed. Every man in G8, gone. Garp let out a low whistle. That's catastrophic. Crane's fingers tapped the desk. We need a full assessment and a counterstrike plan immediately. Steelbone leaned forward, the whir of servomotors audible in the tense silence. Mobilize the nearest fleets. I want every ship ready to sail on my orders. We'll teach the Rocks pirates the cost of challenging the Navy. Sengoku snapped a sharp salute. Understood, sir. I'll coordinate with headquarters at once. He handed the dispatch to Garp, who gave it a grave nod before passing it on to Lieutenant General He for further distribution. The 4 officers stood in heavy silence, the disaster at G8 settling over them like an approaching storm. Lieutenant General Charles handed the dispatch over to Admiral Garp. The moment Garp's eyes scanned the report, his easy grin vanished, replaced by a steely glare. Branch G8 had been completely destroyed, no survivors. And if Charles's memory served him right, there were at least 8 naval detachments above G2000 strength. That meant roughly 2,000 men were gone in an instant. Garp, Charles said, voice tight with urgency, give the order. I'm heading into the second half of the Grand Line to capture the locks. Cap bristled beside him, ready to argue, but no one paid him any mind. Garp turned to Admiral Kong. Governor Kong, your thoughts? Admiral Kong studied Charles for a moment before responding quietly. We've barely any forces stationed in the latter half of the Grand Line now. After this blow, our most capable units there are gone. Sending a regiment to storm the area would be futile. General Crane nodded grimly. Our Navy is stretched to its limits. Germa 66 has us pinned down in the North Sea. Zepha's fleet is pressing on us there, and an old treasure pirate squadron is running riot in the West Sea. To top it off, the South China Sea states are teetering on rebellion. We can't spare the manpower. Garp's gaze hardened as he folded the report. Then we rebuild what we've lost. And fast, Charles. Assemble every available vessel and set sail at once. We'll shore up our positions in the Grand Line and quash the locks before they can do any more damage. Charles nodded. Aye, sir. I'll have my fleet ready by dawn. As the officers dispersed to carry out their orders, a heavy silence fell over the command deck. The Navy had lost thousands of its best men overnight, and every surviving sailor knew there was no turning back. The Grand Line awaited, and with it, the next great battle for the seas. Lieutenant General Ete. He sat hunched over the strategy table, brow creased in worry. The Roger pirates have emerged from the New World, he reported, voice low. They're already sowing chaos from one end of the globe to the other. At this rate, Marine headquarters simply doesn't have the strength to project power back into the New World. Across the table, the imposing figure of Fleet Admiral Kong stiffened. At the single mention of Roger, he shot to his feet so suddenly that his chair scraped the deck. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Before anyone could speak, Kong slammed his fist on the polished wood. Quiet! His roar echoed off the walls. Vice Admiral Garp, seated nearest the door, instantly ducked his head, shrinking back into his chair as though he'd been struck himself. The rest of the officers fell silent. There were no admirals left to debate strategy. Only General Steele and a handful of lieutenant generals remained at headquarters. Elsewhere, half the Marines were spread across distant islands, and the rest had been picked off or reassigned. If marine power hadn't been so depleted, the Lock pirates wouldn't have been free to run rampant for so long. Just as Fleet Admiral Kong opened his mouth to speak, the heavy double doors swung inward. A colonel, breathless and wide-eyed, hurried in, saluting with a crisp snap. Report, sir. Urgent communication from the world government. Kong waved him over. The colonel crossed the room in a few quick strides and handed him a sealed dossier. With trembling fingers, Kong broke the wax seal and unfolded the report. His lips tightened into a thin line as he scanned the pages. "What on earth is the world government planning now?" Kong muttered to himself, eyes narrowing. The rest of the room leaned forward, bracing for the next shocking twist. Iron-boned Kong's expression darkened the moment he opened the dossier. He passed it across the table to the other three. General Jean Guo, A, and Commander. He exchanged uneasy glances. Only Captain Garp scowled. Cyborg Sora broke the silence. "The Rocks pirates have just recruited another formidable fighter. Thoughts?" No one answered, only the faint furrow of Jean Guo's brow and his tightened jaw. Sora waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind our concerns. Priority 1. Set a bounty. How much do we put on a swordsman of this caliber?" Standing beside the holoscreen, Cyborg Sky scrolled through strength assessments. 60 million berries seems appropriate. He's clearly a master swordsman. General Zon Guo nodded in agreement. Commander He tapped his fingers in approval. Captain Garp merely sniffed. 60 million, he said. Life or dead. Iron-boned Kong inclined his head and signaled the messengers. Publish it at once, and include word that the Navy's G8 branch was annihilated. Moments later, portside newsboys cried the headlines at every market stand. Extra! Extra! Rocks pirates wipe out Marine G8 base. No survivors. Rocks crew welcomes new captain, Charles Rockefeller, master swordsman. Bounty, 60,000 berries, dead or alive. The papers fluttered on wind-tossed streets, carrying the warning far and wide. The Rocks pirates were stronger than ever, and their latest recruit, Charles Rockefeller, had a price on his head that only the desperate or the daring would ever attempt to claim. After the Seagull messenger scattered the newspaper across every port and island, the world seemed to slip into collective madness. Wherever a copy landed, its readers were seized by a fierce, almost uncontrollable urge. Ambitious men and women streamed to the docks, eager to make their fortunes on the high seas, while ordinary citizens looked on in mounting dread. Countless lives were already unraveling under the paper's strange influence. Blast it all! Who gave Morgan authorization for this stunt? Arrest him immediately. High above, in the marble halls of the world government, outrage roared through the Secretariat. The news that the Navy's G8 unit had been utterly destroyed was now front-page gossip from Dawn Island to Fishman Island. Order the fleet to stand by, one minister barked. They're to sail straight into the second half of the Grand Line, hunt down every pirate vessel, and make an example of them. Anger gave way to frustration. The Navy was already suffering. Morale low, strategy in tatters, and now this disaster? Tension crackled like lightning in the cramped corridors of Ship Blue 24. Admiral Kong, the cyborg veteran famed for his unflinching resolve, called his senior officers to an urgent briefing. They assembled around the polished conference table, eyes grim. "The world government has issued new orders," Kong began, his mechanical arm whirring softly as he set down the communique. "We are to lead the headquarters fleet into the latter half of the Grand Line and wipe out the pirate threat once and for all. I will be going in person alongside Fleet Admiral Sengoku, Vice Admiral Karp, and several other high-ranking officers. The rest of you will remain here at Marine headquarters to hold our position." A hush fell over the room as Kong issued his final directive. With every channel keyed and every ship standing by, the Navy braced itself for the greatest campaign in its history, one that would ripple across the South Blue and beyond. Chapter 12. The fleet sets sail. Naval headquarters had never been so alive. In every corridor, officers barked orders into communicators. Holoboards flickered with urgent messages. The rhythmic thrum of engines pulsed through the walls as the docked fleet prepared to slip its moorings. Even the great brass of the Admiralty seemed swept up in the excitement. Charles stood on the observation balcony, gripping the railing. As a fresh-faced ensign, his first major assignment was already turning into chaos. Below him, crews scrambled along the decks of battleships, cruisers, and frigates, hoisting sails, running diagnostics, loading ordnance. The air smelled of salt spray and heated metal. At the center of it all was General Cyborg Kang. Clad in his gleaming cybernetic armor, he strode onto the flagship's quarterdeck, flanked by 8 lieutenant generals and a dozen major generals. Wherever he went, aides fluttered like moths around a lantern, carrying briefing folders and data tablets. General Kang paused to survey the assembled officers, his single mechanical eye scanning their faces for hesitation. Receiving none, he signaled the departure. A thunderous roar echoed through the harbor as the fleet engines powered up. Anchors clanked, mooring lines spilled off cleats, and one by one, the warships crept from their berths into the open sea. Charles watched in awe and apprehension. This was history in motion. Yet, as swiftly as the Navy moved to contain the Morgon uprisings, those elusive insurgents seemed to melt into the world's shadows. Satellite relays and informant networks, convinced that General Kang's armada would trap them in a naval net, reported the Morgon slipping away instead. In hours, they fanned out across every ocean, every coastline, scattered from the frozen north to equatorial reefs. It was as if they'd never been in one place to begin with. Word of the Morgan's escape reverberated through the corridors of power. The world government, already furious at these self-styled rebels, resolved to take further action. Late that evening, an encrypted communique arrived at naval headquarters. CP0 operatives were officially authorized to intervene. No longer confined to shadow missions or diplomatic cover, the government's Black Ops enforcers would now pursue Morgon cells on site, arresting anyone deemed a threat to global stability. Charles felt a chill. CP0 was legendary for their efficiency and ruthlessness. If Morgans feared the Royal Navy, they truly dreaded what came next. And if the Admiralty expected the fleet alone to solve this crisis, they were about to be proven wrong. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and turned away from the balcony. Tomorrow, he would be back on deck, ready to do his duty, whatever storms lay ahead. But for tonight, as the fleet vanished over the horizon and CP0 agents mobilized in the capital, the world teetered on the brink of its next great upheaval. And Charles, caught in the rising tide, wondered where he might stand when the waves finally broke.